In the spring of 2013, a young woman named Melissa finally moved out of her mother's house and into a place of her own. At first, it felt like freedom. A quiet home across town, a space that was entirely hers. No one to answer to, no one watching over her, no one telling her what to do. For the first time in her life, she could truly be alone. Or at least, that's what she thought. Because even in those first few weeks, there was something about the house that didn't feel completely empty. It was subtle, almost easy to ignore. The kind of feeling you brush off as imagination. Like the sense that you're not the only one in a room, even when you are. At night, she would sometimes pause in the middle of a task and just listen. Not because she heard anything obvious, but because she felt like she should. Like something might be there if she waited long enough. And then, about 3 months after moving in, things started to get a little bit worse. At first, it was the phone calls. Her phone would ring at random times during the day from unknown numbers. When she answered, there was never anyone speaking. Just silence. And sometimes, something worse, the sound of someone breathing on the other end of the line. And that was only the beginning. Then the flowers started arriving. Huge, beautiful bouquets would just appear on her front step. They were always anonymous, with no card or note to indicate who they were from. While a secret admirer might sound romantic to some, for Melissa living alone, it felt unsettling. Who was sending these? And how did they know her new address so well? She asked her friends, her family, her coworkers, but everyone said it wasn't them. The mystery just deepened, leaving her with a sense of being watched. Around the same time, she started noticing that small items from her kitchen and living room were going missing. It was never anything valuable. It would be a single plate from the drying rack or one of the coasters from her coffee table. A salt shaker vanished from her counter. Then a fork and a knife from her silverware drawer disappeared. They were such small, insignificant things, but because she lived alone, their absence was glaring. She was the only one in the house, the only one who moved these things. She would search everywhere, thinking she must have misplaced them, but they were simply gone. It felt like her own mind was playing tricks on her, and a seed of doubt began to grow. Was she just being forgetful? Melissa had a very specific habit, a little ritual she performed every single night without fail. Before she went upstairs to bed, she would walk over to her living room television and unplug it from the wall. She had this irrational fear that if she left it plugged in overnight, some kind of electrical surge could happen, sparking a fire that would burn her house down while she slept. It was an obsessive-compulsive tendency, she knew that, but it gave her peace of mind. She was meticulous about it, never once forgetting. So one night, during this period of strange calls and missing items, she did her usual routine. She walked over to the TV, bent down, grasped the plug, and pulled it firmly from the wall socket. She saw the plug in her hand, saw the empty outlet, and then she went upstairs to her bedroom, locked the door, and went to sleep. The next morning, she got up, got ready for her day, and came downstairs. As she entered the living room, her eyes drifted over to the television, and she stopped, dead in her tracks. The TV was plugged back into the wall. Her first thought was disbelief. She must have forgotten. It was the only logical explanation. As rare as it was for her to forget her nightly ritual, it had to have happened. She must have been tired or distracted and just thought she'd unplugged it. She tried to brush it off, telling herself not to be paranoid, but the feeling of unease lingered with her all day. So that night, she was determined not to make the same mistake. She went over to the television and made a point of being extra deliberate. She unplugged it, and then she stood there, staring directly at the plug in her hand and the empty socket in the wall. She even put the plug down on the floor and looked again at the outlet, confirming to herself with absolute certainty that it was not plugged in. The cord was lying limp on the carpet. Satisfied, she went upstairs to bed. The next morning, as she started to walk down the stairs, a sense of dread washed over her. Her television was right at the bottom of the staircase, visible as soon as she rounded the corner. She had a terrible, sinking feeling that when she made that turn, her worst nightmare would come true. That it would be plugged in again. That something was happening on her first floor while she was asleep upstairs. She took a deep breath, turned the corner, and her heart dropped into her stomach. The TV was plugged in. This time, there was no rationalizing it away. She was horrified. She knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she had unplugged it. This wasn't a malicious act, not yet anyway. No one had broken anything or hurt her. But the implication was terrifying. Someone was getting into her house at night while she was there, and for some bizarre reason, their only action was to plug in her television. She flew into a panic, running through the first floor of her house, checking every single window, every single door. Everything was locked, just as she had left it. There was no sign of a break-in. She checked every closet, under every piece of furniture, her mind racing. When she was finally satisfied that no one else was in the house with her, she sat down, trying to think what to do. What could she even say if she called the police? "Hello, officer. Someone keeps breaking into my house just to plug in my TV." They would think she was crazy. It was at this point that Melissa developed a very real, very deep fear of her own home, specifically the first floor. She started going to bed earlier and earlier, sometimes as soon as she got home from work, just so she wouldn't have to be downstairs after dark. Imagine living alone in a place that's supposed to be your sanctuary, but being terrified of half of it. Every night she would lie in her bed, her door locked, and strain her ears, listening. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside, became the sound of an intruder downstairs. Melissa was living an absolutely wretched existence, trapped in a cycle of fear in her own home. With that as the context, one night Melissa goes to bed super early, as she usually did now. It was probably only 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the sun was still high in the sky, but she was already upstairs in her bedroom, door locked, trying to feel safe. Eventually, the sun did set, and the house was plunged into darkness, but she still hadn't been able to fall asleep. Her anxiety was too high. So she sat up in bed and decided to watch some TV to distract herself. She turned on her television, and right away, something strange happened. The channels on the screen started changing on their own. They were just cycling through, one after another, without her touching anything. Her first thought was that she must be sitting on the remote. But then she looked down and saw the remote was in her hand. She stared at it, her fingers nowhere near the buttons, and then looked back at the TV. The channels were still flipping over and over. Now, Melissa had what's called a skybox, which is a system that connects the television sets in a house. It meant that her downstairs TV was linked to her upstairs TV. If someone was changing the channel on one, it would change the channel on the other in real time. As she sat there, watching the channel cycle, not touching her remote, the horrifying realization dawned on her. Someone was downstairs right now, using the other remote, flipping through the channels. She was frozen in fear. All she could think to do was to turn her own TV off. That was the one function on her remote that wouldn't affect the other television. She jabbed the power button, and her screen went black. Now, she was sitting in total darkness in a house she was already terrified of, and she was straining her ears, trying to hear any sign that would confirm her fears. Was there really someone downstairs? Or was this just a strange malfunction with the skybox? She sat there, perfectly still, listening. All she could hear was the sound of her own frantic breathing and the pounding of her heart in her chest. She couldn't hear the downstairs TV. She couldn't hear footsteps or doors opening. The house was completely silent. After what felt like an eternity of sitting there in the dark, she grabbed a pillow from her bed, clutched it to her chest, and buried her face in it. She just lay there like that, rigid with fear, until she eventually, somehow, fell into an exhausted sleep. The next morning, when she woke up, the sun was streaming through her window. It was amazing how the daylight could chase away the shadows and the fear. Suddenly, the house didn't feel so menacing. She started telling herself that it had to have been an anomaly, just a weird glitch with the skybox. She thought, I bet I go downstairs and the TV will be unplugged, just like I left it. So she cautiously made her way downstairs, and sure enough, the television was unplugged. For a moment, this confirmed her theory and brought a wave of relief. But then the doubt crept back in. The paranoia was getting to her. She was losing her mind, jumping at shadows. She knew she had to tell someone what was going on. As it happened, that very day, she was going to a family birthday party. It was a perfect opportunity. When she got there, she found her older brother and pulled him aside. She took a deep breath and told him everything. The hang-up calls, the anonymous flowers, the missing items, the television being plugged back in, and finally, the incident with the skybox the night before. At first, he looked at her with skepticism, like she was telling him a ghost story. But as she focused on the specific, tangible things that were happening, like the plug being put back into the wall 2 separate times and the channels changing, he started to see that this was more than just her imagination. The look on his face shifted from doubt to genuine concern. For her brother, all these little weird things started to add up to something that felt genuinely sinister. He offered to come and stay with her for a few days to see for himself if anything happened. Just as they were making the plan, their younger brother walked by and overheard the conversation. Without hesitation, he said, "Oh, I'll stay there too." For 4 days, Melissa's 2 brothers camped out on the first floor of her house. They stayed up late, they watched the doors and windows, and they didn't see or hear a single thing out of the ordinary. The house was completely normal. For Melissa, this was a double-edged sword. On one hand, she felt reassured and safe having them there. But on the other hand, a new, more terrifying thought began to form in her mind. Did this mean that whoever was doing this was watching her house so closely that they knew she had protection now? Did it mean they were just waiting for her brothers to leave? Was she being watched that carefully? When the 4th day came and her brothers were getting ready to pack up and go home, she was practically begging them to stay. The idea of being alone in that house again was unbearable. They did their best to reassure her, telling her she had nothing to worry about, that it was probably all just a series of strange coincidences. They promised that if she experienced anything weird at any time of day or night, she should call or text them immediately and they would be there in a heartbeat. Although their words were meant to be comforting, she did not feel reassured at all. It was starting to get late, at least by her new standards. It was around 3 in the afternoon, and the sun was beginning its slow descent towards the horizon. She knew she needed to go upstairs to her safe room. She said goodbye to her brothers, went back into her house, and immediately began her new security ritual. She must have walked through the house 20 times, checking and rechecking every lock on every window and every door. She looked in every closet, under the beds, making absolutely sure no one was inside and that everything was secure. Finally, she went upstairs to her bedroom, locked the door, and got into bed. But just like most nights, she was so consumed by fear of what might be happening just outside her bedroom door that she couldn't sleep. She just lay there in the utter silence of her room, listening. And then she heard it. It was the unmistakable, quiet click of her back door opening. Her blood ran cold. She heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking through her first floor. Then she heard the television turn on. Her brothers had been watching it last, and they had left the volume turned up really, really high. The sound blared through the entire house, a sudden, shocking burst of noise in the silence. And just as quickly as it turned on, it was turned back off. Whoever was down there knew they had made a mistake, that the loud noise would have woken anyone up. Melissa didn't know what to do. Before, whatever had been happening in her house was subtle, almost deniable. It was things she had to think about to confirm they were really happening. But this was different. This person was now just strolling into her house in the middle of the night and turning on the TV. There was no denying it anymore. Her mind raced. Oh my God, what do I do? She grabbed her phone from the nightstand, her hands shaking so badly she could barely dial. She called her older brother. He picked up right away, his voice sleepy. She whispered frantically into the phone, "Someone is in the house right now." Her brother was instantly awake. He said, "I will be there in 10 minutes. Do not leave your bedroom. Don't do anything. Stay on the phone with me." Melissa was trembling with fear. As slowly and quietly as she possibly could, she got out of bed and crept over to her bedroom window. She wanted to be as far away from the locked door as possible. She peered out the window, her eyes scanning the dark street, waiting desperately to see her brother's car. All the while, she was listening for any sign that the person downstairs had started to walk up the stairs towards her room. Finally, she saw them. Out of the corner of her eye, her brother's car pulled up across the street. He and her younger brother both hopped out. They ran across the street towards her house, vaulted over the side fence, and disappeared down the narrow alley that ran between her house and her neighbor's, heading towards the back. She was still on the phone with him, whispering, "Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see anything?" He replied, "Hold on." He was at the back of the house now, where he knew there was a window that gave a clear view of most of the first floor. She waited, her heart pounding, expecting him to give her a report. There was a pause, a moment of silence on the phone. Then she whispered, "What do you see?" His voice came back, low and serious. "Okay, yep. There is someone in your living room right now. I'm going to hang up and call the police. I'll call you right back." Melissa knew what she had heard was real, but to have it confirmed by her brother, to know for a fact that there was a stranger in her house, took the fear to a whole new level. She was now legitimately fearing for her life. There was an intruder right downstairs, and they had probably been coming into her house for weeks. Her brother hung up to call the police, and Melissa was left alone again, standing in her dark room, listening to a stranger walk around the first floor of her house. Because she could hear the footsteps so clearly downstairs, she made a decision. She decided she would walk over to her bedroom door and look through the keyhole. It was an old door with an oversized keyhole, and if you angled it just right, you could see a small sliver of the first floor at the bottom of the stairs. Very carefully, she tiptoed across the room to the door. As she knelt down to put her eye to the keyhole, her phone, which was in her pocket, started to ring. It wasn't on silent. It was on loud, and the ringtone shattered the silence. It was her brother calling her back. She fumbled for the phone, dropping it on the floor. It was still ringing loudly as she scrambled to pick it up and silence it. Then, on pure reflex, she put her eye back to the keyhole. And standing at the bottom of the stairs, looking right up at her door, was a man. He was wearing a hat pulled down low over his eyes, and he had clearly heard the phone ring. As she watched in horror, he began to walk up the stairs. She fell backwards, screaming at the top of her lungs, yelling for her brothers to get inside. In the next instant, she heard the front door crash open, and her brothers came charging in. She heard an epic struggle on the stairs, a clash of bodies and shouts. And she heard a voice she didn't recognize, the intruder's voice, screaming, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." And then it was quiet. Hesitantly, she opened her bedroom door, wanting to help if she could. She looked out and saw her brothers had the man pinned down on the stairs. He wasn't moving. She saw her younger brother was holding something in his hand. He held it up for her to see, and he just shook his head. It was a knife. The stranger in her house had been carrying a knife. Before she could even process that terrifying piece of information, her older brother reached down and pulled the hat off the intruder's head. and Melissa's world tilted on its axis. It was her mother's ex-boyfriend from 10 years ago. The same man the whole family believed had always had an inappropriate and creepy attraction to Melissa. The police arrived and took him away. He quickly admitted to everything, confessing that he had been sneaking into her house for months. He would never tell them how he was getting in, but he admitted he was there almost every single night. He never gave a good reason for why he did it, he just said he started doing it. The police cited mental illness as the likely culprit, but the family always believed it was something much more sinister. In the end, he was given just 3 years in jail, and the family, once again, cut all ties with him. In February of 2013, a young woman named Kim finally moved out of her parents' house and into a tiny little apartment that she absolutely adored. Kim lived with severe social anxiety. Being out in public, having to make small talk with strangers, was an almost physically painful experience for her. She did everything in her power to stay indoors, to remain in her own controlled environment. She even had a job that allowed her to work from home, so she rarely had to travel. This small apartment was more than just a home. It was her oasis, her fortress. When she was there, she was safe. If she ever had to leave for groceries or an appointment, she would practically run to her car and then run back to her door, minimizing any chance of an unwanted interaction. In those first few weeks of living there, as much as she tried to avoid all human contact, there was one person she was sort of forced to interact with, her landlord. But her landlord turned out to be this wonderful older woman named Olivia, who immediately took a liking to Kim. She seemed to understand Kim's anxieties without needing an explanation and looked at her with a kind, motherly affection. To her own surprise, Kim found herself wanting to interact with Olivia. She had a very comforting presence, and she was just a genuinely nice lady. Even though they didn't interact face-to-face very much, they developed a unique relationship. Olivia loved to cook, and she would often make extra food. She would bring a plate over to Kim's door, knock gently, and then leave it on the doormat for her. Olivia never expected Kim to come out and talk. She knew Kim was uncomfortable with that. She just wanted her to have a nice, home-cooked meal. The arrangement was simple. Whenever Kim was finished eating, she would put the empty plate and utensils back outside her door, and Olivia would come by later to pick them up and wash them. It was a small, kind gesture that meant the world to Kim. She grew to love Olivia and was incredibly happy to have her living nearby. In a way, Olivia's presence made her feel even safer in her new home. About 2 months after moving into this tiny apartment, Kim's doctor started her on a new medication for her anxiety. From past experience, she knew that starting a new prescription often came with a whole host of strange and unpleasant side effects. It always took some time for her body to adjust. And right on cue, as she started taking this new medication, she began to notice that she was becoming incredibly forgetful. Things in her apartment would be in places she had no memory of putting them. Her keys would be in the bathroom, her book would be in the kitchen. Other things would go missing entirely, and she couldn't for the life of her remember where she'd last seen them. Even though she was expecting some side effects, this level of memory loss was frustrating. She also noticed that the new medication made her exceptionally drowsy. It was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion that she couldn't shake. Most days, she had to take a long nap, sometimes for 2 or 3 hours in the middle of the afternoon, just to make it through the rest of the day. Now, because Kim had such intense anxiety about being out in public, the thought of going back to the doctor's office to talk about these side effects was daunting. A doctor's visit meant interacting with a receptionist, a nurse, the doctor, and maybe other patients in the waiting room. It was a whole series of social hurdles she just didn't want to face. So, she made a decision. She would just stick with the medication, let her body adjust, and hope that eventually this new normal of fogginess and fatigue would fade away. She convinced herself that everything would be just fine. During this period, while she was experiencing all these side effects she was attributing to her new medication, she got one of her usual deliveries from Olivia. This time, it was a big Greek salad, which Olivia knew was Kim's favorite. Kim was thrilled. She brought the salad into her apartment and had an idea for a perfect, relaxing afternoon. She decided she would take the salad into her bedroom, turn on Netflix, and eat it in bed. It was going to be an awesome, lazy day. So she got comfortable in bed, started eating her salad, and put on an episode of Portlandia. The next thing she knew, she was waking up. She had fallen asleep right in the middle of eating. One moment she was watching the show, fork halfway to her mouth, and the next she was out cold. When she woke up, she felt groggy and disoriented. She thought to herself, wow, I've never fallen asleep that hard and that fast before. She was literally still holding the fork in her hand. As her eyes adjusted, she noticed something odd. On the other side of the bed, the left side, the sheets and the comforter were all disturbed, as if someone had been lying there. This was strange because Kim always slept on the right side of the bed. It was almost a compulsion for her. She could never sleep on the left side. It felt wrong, like it was bad luck. She reached her hand out and touched that side of the bed where the sheets were rumpled. It was still warm. Her mind immediately started searching for a logical explanation. Well, she thought to herself, I guess I must have rolled over in my sleep, laid on that side of the bed for a while, and then miraculously rolled back to my original position on the right side without spilling my salad or even dropping the fork. As she played this scenario out in her head, it started to sound less and less plausible. It clicked in her mind that what she was thinking was not just unlikely, it was probably impossible. So if that's not what happened, what did? Did that mean someone else had been in her bed? Was someone in her apartment right now? In a surge of adrenaline, she leaped out of bed. She grabbed her phone and typed in 911, her thumb hovering over the dial button, ready to call. She ran through her small apartment, flipping on every single light, her heart hammering against her ribs. She checked the living room, the kitchen, the bathroom, the closets. There was no one there. The front door was still locked from the inside. Everything looked normal. She slowly put her phone away, but her heart was still racing. She was incredibly stressed out by what had just happened because in the back of her mind, she knew she didn't roll over. That didn't happen. This is the moment when Kim began to wonder if all the strange happenings in her apartment were connected to what she had just experienced. This incident, the warm spot in her bed, did not feel like a side effect of her medication. All of a sudden, she started looking at all the other weird things, the missing toothbrush, the misplaced shoes, the items being moved around in a new light. She realized that maybe she had been blind to something else that was happening, that maybe the medication was just a convenient excuse she had been using. A terrifying thought began to take hold. Maybe someone was breaking into her apartment. For the next couple of days, Kim watched her apartment like a hawk. She looked for any indication, any tiny sign that somebody was getting in. But there was nothing. She always locked the door. She always kept the windows shut and locked. She couldn't find any logical point of entry. The only thing that stood out to her was something she had previously dismissed. When she woke up in the mornings, she noticed her bedroom had a very distinctive smell to it. It wasn't her smell, and it wasn't a familiar household smell. It was like another person's smell, a musky, unfamiliar scent. It really freaked her out. She decided it was time to tell her parents. So she called them, and as she was describing out loud what had been going on in her apartment, it was the first time she was hearing the words herself. And hearing it all laid out like that, it sounded so much more creepy, so much more scary than it did when it was all just swirling around in her own head. As she was telling them the story, she became more and more scared to go back to her own apartment. Her dad picked up on the fear in her voice and said, "Hey, I'll go back with you. We'll look around the apartment together and make sure it's safe and secure. And on the way out, we'll check in with your landlady, Olivia, and let her know what's been going on. Everything's going to be fine." They drove back to her apartment, and when they walked inside, everything looked completely normal. They did a quick walkthrough of each room, and nothing seemed out of place. But before her dad left, he said, "Let me just do a closer inspection of the whole place. Let me look everywhere, just to make sure there's not some special way to get in here. It'll give you some peace of mind." So he went into her bedroom and started looking around. He lifted up the mattress and looked underneath the bed frame. Then he opened up her closet. It was a big closet packed with clothes. It wasn't quite a walk-in, but it was big enough that a person could easily stand inside. Her father reached in and started parting the clothes, using the flashlight on his phone to look at the back wall. He pushed on the wall, tapped on it, checking to see if there was any kind of hidden compartment or loose panel. There was nothing. But just before he was about to walk out, he noticed something in the bottom right corner of the inner wall. It was a little blurb of writing in a spot that you could only see if you were standing deep inside the closet, specifically looking for strange things on the walls. He knelt down to get a closer look. It was a small, tiny blurb of text that said, "Come back here so I can look at you." The positioning of the writing was chilling. The only way someone could have written it was if they were lying down in that tiny little corner facing out towards the closet door. And that's when her father looked down at the closet door itself and noticed that one of the horizontal slats was missing, creating a small rectangular peephole. In theory, if you were the person who wrote that message, you would be lying in that exact spot, and your eyes would be looking directly through that missing slat right at her bed. Her father put it all together in that one horrifying moment. He stood up, walked out of the closet to his daughter, and said calmly, "Come over here." He showed her what he had found inside her closet. He pointed to the writing and asked, "Did you write that?" She looked at it, her face pale, and whispered, "No." He looked at her and said, "All right, it's time to leave." They walked outside, went straight to his truck, and he called the police. He told them that someone had been breaking into his daughter's apartment. When the police showed up, they were able to get access to CCTV footage from a nearby building. And on that footage, they captured a grown man regularly going into Kim's apartment in the middle of the night. He wasn't breaking a window or picking a lock. He clearly had a key. It would turn out to be Olivia's grown adult son, a man named Henry, who lived with her. Kim had never even met him, never even knew he existed. Apparently, as soon as Henry saw Kim for the first time, he developed an instant and intense obsession with her. He had created this completely fake, delusional relationship in his mind where he truly believed that he and Kim were a couple, even though Kim didn't even know his name. During the police questioning, Henry explained his entire routine. He said he had gotten sleeping pills and he would grind them up into a fine powder. Anytime his mother was making food to deliver to Kim, which she loved to do and was always excited about, so she would talk about it, Henry would know it was happening. He would secretly slip the powdered sleeping pills into Kim's food. He knew that soon after she ate, she would be fast asleep. Then he would use his mother's spare key to let himself into the apartment. He insisted that he never touched her, that he never laid a hand on Kim. Instead, he would either lie down in the bed next to her while she slept, or he would go into the closet and watch her from his hiding spot. So, for the entire 4 months that Kim had lived in that apartment, the place where she believed she was safest, where she could shut the doors and be away from the world, in reality, there was a psychopath just a few feet away from her almost the entire time. When Olivia found out about what her son had been doing, she made a point to go to Kim and tell her she had absolutely no idea that she was terribly, terribly sorry. But the damage was done. Their friendship was over. On the 17th of October 1941, a 73-year-old man named Philip Peters was supposed to join his friends for a dinner party. But he never showed up. His friends and neighbors knew that Philip, or Phil as they called him, was living alone at the time. His wife had recently had a bad fall, broken her hip, and was recovering in the hospital. So they were already a little worried about Phil being on his own. When he didn't arrive for dinner and wasn't answering his phone, they decided it was better to be safe than sorry. They called the police and asked them to go over to his house and perform a welfare check. When the police arrived at Phil's house, they walked up to the front door and knocked. There was no answer. They tried the door handle, but it was locked. They walked around the house and tried the back door. That was locked too. They peered into the windows, but the house was completely dark inside. Eventually, they had to get another neighbor, who they knew had a spare key, to come over and let them in. When they stepped inside, the scene that greeted them was horrific. There was blood everywhere. It was on the walls, on the floor, and even spattered on the ceiling. And there, in the middle of the kitchen floor, was Phil Peters, lying face down. He had been brutally bludgeoned to death. The police officers immediately drew their weapons, thinking the attacker could still be somewhere in the house. They methodically cleared the entire home, room by room, but there was no one there. A whole team of detectives soon converged on the house and began their investigation. And they realized pretty quickly just how strange the crime scene was. Nothing in the house had been vandalized. Nothing appeared to be stolen. Phil himself was a very modest man, a retired auditor who lived a quiet life. He certainly didn't seem to have any enemies, so a revenge motive didn't make much sense. But the most puzzling part was what the first officers had discovered. Before they found his body, they had found the house to be completely shut and locked tight, with absolutely no sign of forced entry. This meant that whoever was in the house with Phil at the time of his death must have been someone he knew, someone he trusted enough to let inside. Or it was someone who had a key of their own. This made investigators wonder what could possibly motivate someone in Phil's inner circle to commit such a heinous and violent crime, especially when all the obvious motives, like theft or revenge, had seemingly been ruled out. To make matters worse, there was virtually no physical evidence left behind that could point to a suspect. The only piece of evidence they found was the murder weapon, a heavy piece of metal called a stove shaker, which was used to clear out ashes from old stoves. But the person who had used it to kill Phil had taken the time to meticulously wipe it clean. There were no fingerprints, no anything. For months, detectives agonized over this case. They interviewed everyone Phil knew, they chased down every possible lead, but they got absolutely nowhere. The case went cold. 9 months later, Phil's widow, who was now out of the hospital, hired a housekeeper to help her around the house. The housekeeper later told police that as soon as she moved in, she started hearing strange tapping sounds all through the house, but she didn't think much of it. She figured it was just the sounds of an old house settling. Then one day, the day she called the police, she was alone in the Peters residence. She heard the tapping sound again, and this time it seemed to be coming from the kitchen. She thought to herself that it must be a woodpecker just outside the kitchen window. As she looked towards the kitchen, she saw the door on the other side of the room, a door that opened up to a flight of stairs leading to the second floor. And she said that door was slowly, silently creaking open. Out from behind the door came a pale white hand. It reached around the side of the door frame and began to pull the door open even further. The housekeeper screamed. The hand immediately retracted back into the space behind the door. She then heard the sound of someone storming up the stairs and running around on the floor above her before everything went silent again. She didn't hesitate. She ran out of the house as fast as she could and went to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police immediately responded, arriving at the house with their guns drawn. They went inside, thinking that perhaps the murderer had returned to the scene of the crime. They searched the entire house from top to bottom, but once again, there was nothing. There wasn't even a sign of a break-in. So the police went back to the housekeeper and to Mrs. Peters, and they explained that while they couldn't find anyone, given the history of the house, they didn't think it was safe for either of them to be there. The housekeeper refused to go back, and Mrs. Peters was moved back to the hospital where she could be properly looked after. At this point, the police decided they were going to permanently stake out the house. They assigned 2 detectives to watch it around the clock. So the 2 detectives went and parked their car where they had a good view of the property. For a couple of days, they sat there, watching and waiting. They didn't see anything, and they didn't hear anything. Finally, they decided to just go inside and have another look around for themselves. They both walked into the quiet, empty house. They went upstairs, looked around the bedrooms and the bathroom, but still saw nothing out of the ordinary. They went back downstairs and were standing on the first floor, getting ready to leave, when they both heard it. It was the distinct, quiet sound of a doorknob turning somewhere upstairs. They looked at each other, confirming they had both heard the same thing. They drew their weapons and went back up the stairs, searching the different rooms more carefully this time. One of the detectives went into the master bedroom and opened up a closet. He pushed past the old clothes hanging there, and in the bottom left-hand corner of the closet, he saw a foot. It darted back into a tiny, dark space in the very back corner. Without any hesitation, the detective lunged headfirst into the closet and grabbed onto the foot of this mystery person who was crawling into a tiny hidden panel in the back of the closet. He held on tight as the person on the other end fought with all their might to get away. The detective started pulling them out, yelling for his partner to come and help. His partner came charging in, and together they both grabbed onto this person and yanked them out of the closet and into the light. They would later describe him as the strangest looking person they had ever seen. He was super tall, but rail thin, and his skin was so covered in dirt and grime that it appeared to be gray. His name was Theodore Coneys, and he had been secretly living inside the walls of that house for over a year. Before he moved in, Coneys had fallen on hard times. He was homeless, sleeping in alleyways. As it started to get colder in September of 1941, he decided he would approach his longtime acquaintance, Phil Peters, and ask him for some money and maybe for a place to crash for a couple of days. But as it happened, when he got to Phil's house, Phil wasn't there. He was at the hospital visiting his wife. The house was vacant. Coneys saw an opportunity, and he broke in. At first, his plan was just to steal some food, get warmed up for a bit, and then leave. But as he was looking through the house for things to take, he noticed something in the back of one of the closets. There was a small, loose panel that led to a tiny, almost secret attic space. It wasn't being used for anything because it was impossibly small. You would have to be incredibly skinny just to get through the little square opening that led into it. And once you got in, you could only get in by slithering head first. You couldn't stand up. You'd be lying down the entire time. You couldn't even extend your legs all the way if you were a full-grown adult. You'd be kind of tucked up in a pseudo-fetal position. But to Coneys, this tiny, cramped space was a huge upgrade from living on the streets. He decided that this is where he was going to live for the winter. So he went around the house gathering supplies. He took blankets, food from the pantry, and filled bottles with water. He moved all of his supplies into his tiny little attic space. Then he went back downstairs, locked the front door again, made sure everything looked exactly the way it was when he first broke in, and he retreated into his little space, shutting the panel behind him. When Phil came home that night, he didn't notice a thing. And for the next several weeks, Phil lived his life completely unaware that he had a man living in his attic. Every time Phil would leave the house, Coneys would sneak out of his hiding spot, go downstairs, make himself some coffee, get a bite to eat, and then go back up to his little space. He even managed to carefully cut into the house's electrical wiring system. He stole one of Phil's radios, brought it into his cubby with him, attached it to the wires he had exposed, and now he was able to lie there and listen to the news, so he didn't feel so completely isolated from the outside world. But about a month after he moved in, Coneys made a mistake. He left his little spot to go downstairs because he thought Phil was gone for the day. He got to the kitchen and was going through the fridge. When he shut the refrigerator door, he looked over and there was Phil, standing there, looking at him with a mixture of confusion and anger, asking what he was doing in his kitchen. In a blind panic, Coney's grabbed the heaviest thing he could reach, the cast iron stove shaker, and he beat Phil to death. Not knowing what else to do, he wiped off the murder weapon and left it where it was. He went back to the fridge, got more food and drink, and then he went right back up to the tiny attic where he lived. For the next 9 months, he would follow the police investigation of Phil Peters' murder on his stolen radio, curled up inside his hiding spot in Phil Peters' house. Coney's was quickly found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. After hearing his sentence read to him in court, he said out loud for everyone to hear, "Now I feel safe. I'll have a better home than I've had in years." Let me know what you think about today's episode in the comments. Which of these stories made you feel the most uncomfortable? If you like this story, there is a whole series of true crime stories waiting for you, just as strange, just as creepy, and sometimes even worse. Because, as these cases show, the scariest thing is not what is out there in the dark. That is what might have happened in your life that you never realized. Sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that actually happen. Events so strange, so perfectly timed, that they feel like they must have come from a movie script, but they didn't. They happened to real people in the real world. And today we're going to look at 3 of those stories. In January of 2015, a 27-year-old man from Texas named George Pickering III was living his life just like any other young man. He had hopes, he had dreams, he had a family that loved him. But one day, everything changed in an instant. George suffered a massive stroke. It came out of nowhere, a sudden and devastating medical event that sent shockwaves through his family. He was rushed to the hospital, and every second felt like an eternity for his parents and his brother as they followed the ambulance, their minds racing with a million terrifying thoughts. At the hospital, George was immediately admitted and the medical team went to work. But the situation was dire. His condition was so severe that he had to be put on life support. The rhythmic hiss and pump of the machines became the new grim soundtrack to his family's life as they waited for any sign of good news. But the good news never came. Instead, the doctors eventually came to the family with the worst possible update. They sat them down in a sterile, quiet room and explained the situation. They had run every test they could. They had monitored his brain activity around the clock. And the conclusion was unavoidable. George, they said, was brain dead. There was no activity, no sign of consciousness, nothing to indicate that he would ever wake up again. The doctors were gentle but firm. They advised the family that realistically, the most compassionate thing to do would be to consider pulling George off of life support. The machines were keeping his body functioning, but he, the person they knew and loved, was gone. It was a conversation no family ever wants to have. George's family was completely and utterly devastated. It was like the floor had just dropped out from under them. The news was so crushing for George's father, also named George, that he couldn't even process it. He was overwhelmed with a grief so profound, so suffocating, that he just got up and left the hospital. He couldn't stand to be in that building, couldn't stand to hear those words one more time. He just needed to get away, to breathe, to try and make sense of a world that no longer made any. In his father's absence, the heavy burden of the decision fell on George's mother and his brother. They were reeling from the news themselves, lost in a fog of sorrow. They talked with the doctors, asking every question they could think of, hoping for a different answer, a sliver of hope. But the medical opinion was unanimous. There was no hope. And so, with the heaviest hearts imaginable, they gave their consent. They told the doctors, yes, we are prepared to pull George off of life support. Once that decision was made, things moved quickly. The hospital staff, following protocol, put George's name on an organ donor list. It was a small, cold comfort, the idea that his tragedy could mean a new chance at life for someone else. While that process began, his mother and brother started the unthinkable task of making funeral plans. They were numb, just going through the motions, trying to navigate this new horrific reality. Later that day, George's father returned to the hospital. He had spent hours trying to come to terms with the news, but he just couldn't. When he walked back into the hospital and found out that his wife and other son had already consented to have George removed from life support, he was furious. It wasn't just grief anymore. It was a deep, burning anger. He refused to believe it. He did not believe that his son was totally, irreversibly brain dead. He looked at his wife and his other son and couldn't understand how they could give up so easily. In his mind, there had to be a chance. He felt with every fiber of his being that they should at least give George a little more time, just a few more hours, a few more days, anything. He was convinced that if they just waited, George would give them a signal, some sign that he was still in there, still fighting. But his wife and son tried to explain. They told him about their conversation with the doctors. They repeated the grim prognosis, the finality of it all. They told him there was no hope, no reason to delay the inevitable. It was time, they said, to let him go. But George's father was not having it. He saw it as giving up, as a betrayal of his son. He stormed out of the waiting room, his mind set. He found the doctors and demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of desperation and rage, that they keep his son on life support. Just a little bit longer, that's all he was asking for. The doctors listened patiently, but their answer was the same. They explained again that there was no medical reason to do so. Keeping him on the machines wouldn't change the outcome. And then they added another layer of pressure. They told him that by delaying, he was jeopardizing the people who were waiting for George's organs. People whose lives were hanging in the balance, waiting for a transplant. From a medical and ethical standpoint, they explained, they needed to expedite the process, not delay it. This was the best thing to do for everyone involved. For George's father, this was the final straw. He felt like no one was listening, like the whole world was conspiring to take his son away from him. He was completely distraught, his mind a whirlwind of grief and anger. He ran back to his son's room in the ICU. He saw George lying there, still and silent, surrounded by machines. He stumbled over to the bed and collapsed over his son's body. He grabbed George's hands, holding them tightly, and just stared at him. He prayed. He begged. He pleaded with his son to give him a sign, anything to prove that he was still there, that his father's intuition was right. But his son remained motionless. Before long, the medical staff began to filter into the room. It was time to begin the procedure, to remove George from the machines that were keeping his body alive. As they came in, with their quiet, professional demeanor, something inside George's father snapped. It was a moment of pure desperation. He couldn't let it happen. He bolted out of the room, past the surprised nurses and doctors. He didn't stop, didn't look back. He ran out of the hospital, his heart pounding in his chest. He went straight to his car, fumbled for his keys, and opened the door. From inside his vehicle, he retrieved his gun. Then, with the cold, heavy weight of the weapon in his hand, he ran back into the hospital, back down the hallway, back to his son's room. He burst through the door and aimed the gun at the medical team. He ordered them to stop what they were doing and to get out of the room immediately. The doctors and nurses froze, their eyes wide with shock and fear. Thankfully, they had not yet begun the process of actually removing George from life support. The machines were still running. Seeing the gun and the look of sheer desperate resolve on the father's face, they didn't argue. They backed out of the room slowly, hands raised. Once the room was empty, George's father walked over to the door and locked it. For the next several hours, a tense standoff unfolded. He kept the gun aimed at the locked door, a lone guardian at his son's bedside. He spent those hours talking to George, holding his hand, his eyes never leaving his son's face, searching, hoping, praying for that sign. Eventually, the hospital's security and local police had been alerted, and soon the SWAT team arrived. They were heavily armed, clad in tactical gear, and they began stacking up in the hallway right outside the door to George's room. The negotiator started yelling into the room, his voice firm but calm, telling George's father to put the gun down, to open the door, to let them come in. But the father barely heard them. His entire world had shrunk to the space of that hospital bed, to the feel of his son's hand in his... He was just looking down at his son, his voice a low murmur. "Come on, son. Squeeze my hand. Please, just squeeze my hand." Just as the SWAT team was preparing to breach, right as they kicked in the door and swarmed into the room, George's father felt it. A faint but unmistakable pressure. He had reached down and grabbed his son's hand one last time, and his son squeezed his hand back. The moment he felt that squeeze, it was as if all the anger, all the tension, all the desperation just drained out of him. He dropped the gun. It clattered to the floor. He immediately surrendered peacefully to the SWAT team. They pushed him to the ground, and as they were detaining him, putting him in handcuffs, George's father wasn't resisting. He was yelling, his voice filled with a triumphant, hysterical relief. He was yelling for the doctors to come back into the room. "My son is okay. He's okay," he shouted. And sure enough, when the doctors cautiously re-entered the room, they saw it too. George was not the same man he was a few hours ago. He was moving his hand. His eyes were open. And most incredibly, he was making eye contact. He was aware. He was there. Over the next few days and weeks, George Pickering III made a totally full recovery. He would later be told the whole story about how his family had agreed to let him go, about how his father had refused. And he learned that had his father not stepped in, had he not staged that desperate, dangerous standoff and bought him those few extra hours on life support, George would have died. As for his father, he was charged with aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. His actions, while born of a father's love, had been a serious crime. He was ultimately sentenced to 10 months in prison. But for him and for the rest of his family, it was a small price to pay. He had saved his son's life. He had trusted his gut, and he had been right. In 1959, in the small town of Lake City, South Carolina, there was a very gifted 9-year-old African-American boy named Ronald McNair. Ronald was one of those kids who just seemed to be good at everything he tried. He excelled in school, he was a talented musician, he was a natural at sports. But for all his varied talents, there was only one thing that truly captured his imagination, that filled him with a sense of wonder and possibility. And that was outer space. The idea of leaving Earth, of floating among the stars and planets, was more fascinating to him than anything else. And so, as a 9-year-old child, he made a very serious, very determined decision. One day, he was going to become an astronaut. The problem was, he had absolutely no idea how to do that. How does a little boy in South Carolina become an astronaut? He figured the first logical step was to learn everything he could. He needed to read about science, about physics, about rockets. He decided he would go to his local library and take out some books on NASA, the famous organization that was sending American heroes into the cosmos. There was, however, a very big issue with his plan. This was 1,959 inches, the Deep South. The library in his town, the Lake City Public Library, only served white patrons. It was a segregated library. Ronald knew this. Every black person in town knew this. It was just a fact of life, one of the many invisible walls that defined their world. But Ronald was determined. He figured, you know what, I'm a polite kid. I'm not looking for trouble. I can just get in there, get my books, and get out before anyone even really notices me. But as soon as he pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside, he knew he was wrong. The library went quiet. Every person in there, all of whom were white, stopped what they were doing and just stared at him. Ronald could feel their eyes on him, a mixture of surprise and disapproval. He kept his head down, trying to make himself as small as possible. He walked quietly through the aisles, his heart beating a little faster now. He found the science section, his eyes scanning the shelves until he found what he was looking for. Books about aviation, about astronomy, about the space program. He carefully pulled a couple of books from the shelf, holding them close to his chest. Then he took a deep breath and walked back to the front counter. He placed the books on the counter and looked up at the librarian, a white woman with a stern expression. He very politely asked her if he could check these books out. The librarian looked down at him, then at the books, and then back at him. Her face hardened. "Young man," she said, her voice sharp, "you better get out of here before I call the police." Ronald stood there for a second, a 9-year-old boy holding books about the stars, being threatened with the police for wanting to read them. He looked up at the librarian, thought for a moment, and then, in a moment of quiet defiance, he just hopped up onto her counter and sat there. He folded his hands in his lap and said, "Okay, I'll wait for the police." The librarian was totally outraged. This was not the reaction she expected. She immediately picked up the phone and called the police, and then she called Ronald's mother. Before long, 2 white police officers arrived. They walked into the library, and the librarian rushed over to them. She started talking frantically, pointing back at the small boy sitting on her counter, gesticulating, explaining that he was the problem, he was why she had called. The officers listened, looking over at Ronald, who was just sitting there quietly, and then back at the librarian. They seemed more annoyed than anything else. Finally, one of the officers said to her, "Why don't you just let the kid take the books out?" The librarian was totally offended by this suggestion. She began to defend her decision, explaining the rules, the policy, why she had to call them instead of just letting him borrow the books. As she was in the middle of her tirade, Ronald's mother came rushing into the library. She was out of breath, her face etched with worry. She ran over to her son, checking to make sure he was okay. Then she looked up at the police officers and the librarian, trying to piece together what was happening. At this point, the police officers were just completely over the whole situation. They turned back to the librarian and said, more firmly this time, "You know what? You really ought to let him take the books out." And with that, the officers just turned around and left. The librarian, however, was not about to just give in. She was still very upset. She stormed over to Ronald's mother and said, "You shouldn't let your son come in here." Ronald's mother looked at this furious librarian, then she looked down at her son, who had his head bowed. And then she noticed the books on the counter. Books about space. She knew all about Ronald's love for outer space, his big dreams. In that moment, she understood exactly what had happened. She thought about it for a moment, gathering her composure. Then she looked up at the librarian, her voice calm and steady. "Well," she said, "since he's here already, can he take out those books?" "He'll take good care of them." The librarian was still fuming, but she knew it was a losing fight. The police had left, and the boy's mother was standing there, resolute. So, very reluctantly, with a scowl on her face, she grabbed the books from the counter and practically jammed them into Ronald's arms. Ronald's mother gave him a little nudge and said, "What do you say?" Ronald, now holding his precious new books about NASA and space, looked up at the librarian, a genuine smile spreading across his face, and said, "Thank you, ma'am." And then he and his mom turned around, and they walked out of the library together. Ronald would go on to read those books, and many, many more. His passion for science and space only grew stronger. He would go on to earn his PhD in physics from MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the most prestigious universities in the entire world. After graduation, his childhood dream came true. He was selected by NASA to become an astronaut. In 1984, Ronald McNair went into outer space. He was the second African American to ever do so. And while he was in orbit circling the Earth, it's said that he played his saxophone for his crewmates, a moment of pure beauty and artistry high above the world that had once tried to deny him a library book. Then, in 1986, Ronald was chosen again for another mission to outer space. He was assigned to the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger. But tragically, 73 seconds after takeoff, the shuttle exploded in the sky, killing Ronald and the 6 other astronauts on board. It was a national tragedy, a moment of profound loss for the country and the world. Following his death, a powerful and symbolic change took place back in his hometown of Lake City, South Carolina. The very same library that had once tried to turn him away because of the color of his skin officially renamed itself. It became the Ronald E. McNair Life History Center, a permanent tribute to the little boy who refused to be told no, who sat on a counter and waited for the police because all he wanted to do was read about the stars he would one day visit. The United States formally entered the Second World War in December of 1941 after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Japanese military. The nation was plunged into a global conflict, and young men from every corner of the country answered the call to serve. About 6 months after the war began for America, a 21-year-old native of Alabama named Henry Irwin made the decision to join the Army Reserve. For nearly 2 years after that, Henry went through extensive and rigorous military training. He was eventually made into a radio operator and was assigned to the crew of a B-29 bomber. A B-29 Superfortress was a marvel of modern engineering at the time. It was this huge, powerful aircraft, a flying fortress whose sole purpose was to fly long distances and drop massive payloads of bombs on enemy targets. In February of 1945, as the war in the Pacific was reaching its brutal climax, Henry and his B-29 bomber unit were sent to the Pacific Theater. Their mission was clear and dangerous: drop bombs on the Japanese. 2 months after arriving, in April of 1945, Henry's B-29 was given a particularly important task. They were assigned to be the lead bomber in a group attack on a Japanese chemical facility. The target was located about 125 miles north of Tokyo. It was a high-stakes mission. Aside from his primary job of operating the radio inside the B-29, Henry had another crucial role when their plane was designated as the lead attacker. His job was to organize the other planes in the attack formation. The way he would do this was by dropping a series of phosphorus smoke bombs out of his plane. The idea was that these bombs would fall to the ground, and once they did, they would release a thick cloud of white smoke. Henry would then get on his radio and communicate with the other pilots in their squadron. He would use the smoke cloud as a visual reference point on the ground, a rallying point in the sky. He would basically tell them to organize themselves in relation to the smoke, flying to specific positions to create the perfect formation for their bombing run. Once all the pilots were properly organized, they would proceed to their target and commence the attack. On this particular mission, Henry was in his usual position inside the plane, right behind the front turret gun, which was located towards the front of the aircraft. The flight was tense, as all combat missions were. At a certain point, his pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, telling him it was time. "Start dropping the smoke bombs," he ordered. Henry did as he was told. He reached over and pulled a lever, which opened up a chute on the bottom of the plane. A series of smoke bombs began tumbling out of it, falling towards the earth below. Now, these weren't simple smoke grenades. As soon as he pulled that lever, all of the smoke bombs in that chute were ignited. They were on a timed fuse. They were designed to tumble out of the plane, and then, just before hitting the ground, they would ignite a chemical reaction inside them, and thick white smoke would start billowing out. But on this day, something went terribly wrong. After Henry pulled the lever, a couple of the smoke bombs fell out of the chute as planned. But one of them, for some reason, didn't fall cleanly. It got turned around as it tumbled down the chute, caught itself on the lip of the opening, and then bounced back up, back into the plane. It shot back into the cabin and struck Henry square in the face. The impact shattered his nose, and then, in that same instant, the bomb's fuse timer ran out and it ignited. The bomb erupted in a blaze of white-hot phosphorus. It literally lit Henry's face on fire. The chemical fire instantly blinded him. Now, smoke bombs aren't considered lethal devices in the way that high explosive bombs are. They don't explode with a massive concussive force. But make no mistake, you would not want to be anywhere near a military-grade smoke bomb when it went off. In order for it to emit that very thick, long-lasting smoke, the bomb ignites a chemical fire within itself that burns at an extremely high temperature. So when this smoke bomb came back inside the plane and went off right in front of Henry, those burning chemicals sprayed all over his face and his flight suit. That's why he caught on fire. And if that wasn't bad enough, the bomb also did exactly what it was designed to do. It filled the entire front of the plane completely with thick, choking smoke, making it impossible for the pilots to see anything. They were flying blind. Despite his face burning, his nose shattered, and being unable to see, all Henry could think about was one thing. If he didn't get this smoke bomb off the plane in the next few seconds, they were all going to crash and die. The pilots couldn't see the controls, they couldn't see the horizon. The plane was in grave danger. So, instead of trying to put out the flames that were consuming his own body, Henry began feeling around on the floor for the smoke bomb, which was now essentially a white-hot fireball rolling around on the metal deck. When his burned hands finally found it, he did something incredible. He pulled the searingly hot device into his chest, trying to smother it as best he could against his body, absorbing the intense heat. With his body now completely engulfed in flames, Henry began to low-crawl his way towards the front of the plane. He couldn't see, but he knew the layout of the cockpit by heart. He knew that just by touch, he would be able to find a small window near the co-pilot's seat. He crawled agonizingly across the floor, on fire, blinded, in unimaginable pain, but driven by a single purpose. He finally reached the spot. He could feel the frame of the window above him. With a final surge of adrenaline and willpower, he managed to lift the burning smoke bomb up and shove it out the window. And then, his mission accomplished, he collapsed on the ground. He passed out completely, still on fire, fully expecting to die. A few seconds later, with the source of the smoke now gone, the thick clouds inside the cockpit began to clear. The pilot, who had put the plane on autopilot but had to drop significantly in altitude because they were starting to stall, could finally see again. He looked at his instruments and then out the window and saw they were only about 300 feet from hitting the water of the Pacific Ocean. He grabbed the controls, pulled back with all his might, and managed to get the massive B-29 out of its death dive. He narrowly escaped crashing into the water. He leveled the plane out, turned it around, and began flying back to base. On this return trip, the rest of the crew, who were shaken but unhurt, began to assess the damage. That's when they saw Henry. He was lying on the side of the cockpit, his body still smoldering. They rushed over, grabbed a fire extinguisher, and put out the last of the flames. They fully expected him to be dead. No one could survive what he had just been through. But, to their absolute shock and horror, he was still alive. They gave him a shot of morphine for the pain, their hands shaking as they did so. They still expected him to die any moment. But Henry didn't die. Instead, he was conscious, and incredibly, he was cheerful. On the long flight all the way back to base, he would ask each of his crew members if they were okay. And they would all answer, their voices thick with emotion, "Yeah, I'm just fine, Henry. It's you we're concerned about here." When the pilot finally landed the damaged B-29 back at their base on the island of Tinian, Henry's body had stiffened up so dramatically from his horrific burns that the doctors and medics couldn't actually get him out of the plane's side door. They had to get a maintenance crew to come and dismantle a section of the plane's fuselage just to extricate him, The doctors who received him on the tarmac fully expected Henry was going to die. His wounds were some of the worst they had ever seen. But since he hadn't died yet, they resolved to do everything in their power to try and save him. They put him through dozens of grueling surgeries. One of the most painful procedures involved trying to remove the tiny chemical flecks of phosphorus from the smoke bomb that had embedded themselves in his eyes. Since these chemicals would combust as soon as they made contact with oxygen, every time the surgeons pulled out one of these tiny flecks, it would burst into flames, painfully burning Henry's eyes a little bit more. While Henry was undergoing all of these surgeries, fighting for his life, the rest of his B-29 crew immediately went to their commanding officer. They told him the whole story, what Henry had done, how he had saved all of their lives at the cost of his own body. They were adamant. "You have to put Henry in for the Medal of Honor," they said. The Medal of Honor is the highest and most prestigious award for valor that can be achieved in the U.S. military. After the commanding officer heard the incredible story of what Henry had done, he agreed without hesitation. In record time, he got all the necessary paperwork processed and got Henry approved for the award. But there was a problem. There were no actual physical medals of honor on the island to present to Henry. The officers and the rest of his crew were deeply worried that Henry would die before the actual medal could be shipped out to the island to be given to him. They felt it was critical for him to receive it while he was still alive. It turned out there was only one Medal of Honor on the entire island. It was a display model inside a glass case in a small military museum. So one of the officers from Henry's crew went to the museum, shattered the glass case, took the display medal, and rushed to the hospital. He went straight to Henry's bedside and put the medal around his neck. And after that, somehow, against all odds, Henry just didn't die. After dozens and dozens of more surgeries, Henry actually regained sight in one of his eyes, and he slowly regained the use of most of his body. He had survived the unsurvivable. Henry would later be asked in an interview what it was like to do the very heroic thing that he did. And he would say, with incredible understatement, "Well, I only moved the bomb 13 feet. But 13 feet feels like 13 miles when you're on fire." Henry would go on to be honorably discharged from the military. He returned home to Alabama, and he would spend the next 37 years of his life working closely with other burn victims, using his own incredible story to keep them positive and optimistic about their own recovery. He also went on to have a family, 4 children in total, one of whom became an Alabama state senator. In 2002, Henry Irwin died of natural causes. He was 80 years old, having lived a full and meaningful life for decades after an event that should have ended it in a fiery crash in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Sometimes the most frightening stories are not the ones about monsters hiding in the dark or shadowy figures in the woods. They are the stories that start in the most ordinary of places. A radio station, a military ship, a county jail. They involve regular people making what seem like small decisions, but those decisions create ripples that spiral into something truly unbelievable and often tragic. Today we're looking at 3 stories where a simple choice, a fun contest, and a routine arrest went horribly wrong. One is a story of incredible laziness, another of a game that turned deadly, and the last is a story of a man being completely forgotten by the world. To do this first story justice, it has to be told in the first person. So just know, for this part, I am simply an actor relaying someone else's experience. I was on a U.S. military ship sitting in the wardroom. The wardroom is basically the officer's lounge, a place to grab a coffee or a bite to eat. It was early morning, and the operations officer came stumbling in. This guy was the absolute definition of not a morning person. He was bleary-eyed, moving like a zombie, and clutching a bagel in his hand. He sits down at the table directly across from me, barely conscious, and starts gnawing on his breakfast. I was sitting with my back to the outboard side of the ship, which is the outside wall. Right next to my head was a porthole, and the morning sun was beaming through it. The light cut right across the room and was hitting this officer directly in his face. He's squinting, trying to block the sun with his hand, looking totally miserable. I'm just watching him, expecting him to do the logical thing and just shift his chair a few inches to the left or right to get out of the sun's path. But he doesn't. Instead, this officer slowly, and I mean slowly, reaches for the phone that was mounted on the wall. He picks up the receiver, brings it to his ear, and in a groggy voice he says, "Yeah, bridge!" Yeah, this is ops. "I need you to adjust our path." He pauses for a second. "Yeah, 156. Yep, that's about right." "Okay. All right, bye." He hangs up the phone and just sits there. He hasn't moved an inch. He's still squinting, looking up at the sunlight that's blazing on his face. I'm looking back and forth between him and the porthole, trying to figure out what just happened. And then I see it. The circle of light from the porthole gradually begins to shift off of him. It moves across the table, onto the wall behind him, and then it just stops. By ordering the bridge to change the ship's course by about 15 degrees, he had changed the ship's position just enough to move the sun off his face. He literally redirected thousands of tons of steel and a crew of hundreds of people just because he was too lazy to move his chair. I was in total awe. I couldn't believe what I had just witnessed. For a second, I worried that the sheer, unbelievable brilliance of this move was lost on him in his tired state. But then, as I'm just staring at him, he takes a bite of his bagel, looks up at me, and gives me a little smile before going right back to his breakfast. In November of 2006, Nintendo released a brand new gaming console. It was called the Wii, and it was an absolute sensation. It was so popular that it sold out almost completely right away. By January of the next year, you still couldn't find one on the shelves in most places around the world. People were going crazy, spending unbelievable amounts of money online just to get their hands on one. A radio station in Sacramento, California called KDND managed to get a hold of one of these coveted systems. They decided they would give it away as a prize in an on-air contest. The contest had a catchy, if a bit silly, name. It was called Hold Your Wii for a Wii. The premise was simple. Contestants would be given lots and lots of water to drink. The person who could hold it the longest, meaning they didn't go to the bathroom to urinate, would win the brand new Nintendo Wii. In the days leading up to the contest, the radio station promoted it very aggressively on the air. As they did, lots of concerned listeners started calling in. They warned the station that drinking too much water too quickly can actually be deadly, but the station just brushed these concerns off. The on-air personalities said they were aware of the risks and that all the contestants would be signing a waiver. This waiver, they claimed, meant the station was not responsible for whatever happened to them. On the morning of Friday, January 12th, 18 contestants showed up at the KDND radio station. They were all led into a room and handed their waivers to sign. One contestant later said the waiver only seemed to cover publicity issues, not anything about health and safety. One of the people there that day was a 28-year-old woman named Jennifer Strange. Jennifer was a mother of 3, and she was there trying to win this Wii for her kids. She, along with everyone else, signed the paper and was then ushered into the contest room. The rules were laid out. They were each handed an 8-ounce bottle of water. Every 15 minutes, they were expected to finish that water bottle. If they couldn't finish it in time, or if they got up to use the bathroom at any point, they were out of the contest. The contest officially started at 6:45 a.m. By 8 a.m., after 5 bottles of water had been consumed, a number of contestants had already pulled themselves out of the game to use the bathroom. The radio staff, however, felt like the contest was moving too slowly. So, to speed things up, they gave the remaining contestants, including Jennifer, a larger bottle of water to drink from. Over the next several hours, all of the contestants, except for Jennifer and one other person, had dropped out. The pain was just too much. They had to go to the bathroom. Jennifer was heard on the air, her voice strained, saying that it hurt so much. One of the radio hosts just laughed and said, "Well, do you need to lay down?" Then someone else piped up and said, "She can't even walk." And the room just filled with laughter, and nobody did anything. Around this time, a nurse who was listening to the broadcast called into the station. She very emphatically told them that what they were doing was a really, really bad idea. She said, "You're going to get someone killed from water intoxication." Water intoxication, also known as water poisoning, is a very real and dangerous condition. In a nutshell, when you drink way too much water in a short period of time, it dilutes the sodium levels in your bloodstream. This can cause your cells, including your brain cells, to swell up. This swelling can lead to comas, seizures, and even death. The host, after hearing this nurse's very serious concern, just turned away from the phone and yelled to the contestants, "Hey, is anybody dying out there?" Then he just laughed and hung up on the nurse. A little while later, you can hear one of the hosts on the broadcast commenting on how Jennifer's belly looked really strange. It had become totally distended and bloated. They joked that it looked like she was pregnant. At some point, both Jennifer and the other remaining contestant started vomiting. But instead of dropping out of the contest, they just continued to drink more water, determined not to go to the bathroom. But finally, the pain became too much for Jennifer to bear. She dropped out of the contest, and she finally relieved herself. For coming in second place, she was given tickets to a Justin Timberlake concert. On her drive home from the radio station, Jennifer began experiencing a horrific headache. It was so bad that she was just sobbing uncontrollably. Through her tears, she called one of her coworkers and told her she wasn't going to be able to make it into work that day. Her head just hurt too much. After she hung up, the coworker she had just spoken to was really concerned about her. She decided to call Jennifer's mother to let her know what was going on. About an hour later, Jennifer's mother headed over to Jennifer's house to check on her. When she got there, she found Jennifer dead in her bathroom. She had died from water poisoning. The station was ultimately sued by Jennifer's family. A jury found the station was negligent, and they were ordered to pay over $16 million in damages. In 2005, a 57-year-old man named Stephen Slevin was physically a healthy man, but mentally he was really struggling. He was depressed and felt like his life didn't have any purpose anymore. So, in August of that year, he decided to just get in his car and go on a road trip. He didn't have a destination. He just felt like if he could get out on the open road and just go somewhere, anywhere, he might start to feel better. On this road trip, he eventually began drinking alcohol. Before long, he was swerving along a New Mexico highway. A police officer saw his erratic driving and pulled him over. Once Stephen failed his sobriety test, the police officer arrested him for a DWI. Stephen was brought to a local detention center. During his booking process, it was discovered that he had a history of mental illness. So the officers, following that county's policy, decided to segregate him from the rest of the general population. In an effort to protect Stephen from himself, they moved him into a padded cell on the first floor. They removed all of his clothing and put him in what's called a suicide smock. It looks kind of like a big, thick blanket that's wrapped around your upper body. It keeps inmates warm and modest, but it also prevents them from being able to ball up their clothes to create a noose they could hurt themselves with. After a few days in this padded cell, Stephen was moved to a better cell. This one had a window, a shower, and a toilet. He was kept there for 2 weeks under strict medical observation. But at the end of those 2 weeks, for reasons that are still not entirely clear, Stephen, this mentally unstable man, was moved into solitary confinement to await his trial for the DWI. Solitary confinement is a type of imprisonment where an inmate is put into a single-person cell and they are kept there nearly around the clock, without any significant human interaction. The psychological effects of solitary confinement are well documented and they are terrifying. Just 15 days in solitary can be enough to cause permanent psychological damage. Stephen's first few weeks in solitary were actually okay. He was allowed to write to his family, and he was able to detox and reflect on his life. During those first few weeks, it was noted in the records that Stephen was very polite in his very limited interactions with the officers who were dropping food off through the slot in his door. Also, when Stephen had a few minor medical issues, instead of throwing a fit, he would just knock on the inside of his door and wait patiently for someone to acknowledge him. This often took a long time, but he never got frustrated or angry. But by January of 2006, so roughly 3 months into his solitary stint, Stephen had not received any updates on when his case was going to go to trial. And he was starting to lose his grip on reality. He was having these severe panic attacks, and he was suffering from intense hallucinations. He desperately wanted to find out how much longer he was going to be kept in that cell, but nobody would tell him anything. He tried writing letters to his family, asking them for help, or asking them to try to get an update on his case. But when he went to actually write the letters, his hands would shake so severely from the stress and anxiety that he literally could not write. Starting that January, Stephen began spending the bulk of his day huddled in the corner of his cell with his knees tucked up to his chest, just rocking back and forth. He was supposed to be allowed out of his cell a few times a month, but in April of that year, that stopped. He almost never left his cell again. And without ever leaving his cell, Stephen was unable to bathe. His skin began to develop a fungus and started to fall off in patches. His fingernails grew long and curled. His teeth began to rot. Finally, on the 8th of May 2007, after 1 year and 8 months of being in solitary confinement, Stephen was transferred out of his cell to a behavioral institute in Las Vegas, Nevada. After bathing and shaving and getting his hair cut and receiving proper medical treatment, he was back to his normal self within a couple of days. While he was there, he had a chance to speak to a lawyer. The lawyer would later say that during their entire meeting, Stephen just kept asking, "Where have I been?" The lawyer explained to him, "You've been in solitary confinement, awaiting trial. You've been there for almost 2 years." Stephen was shocked. He literally didn't believe him. He actually couldn't remember that huge chunk of his life. It was as if his mind, to protect itself, had completely repressed the trauma. But as the lawyer told him more about it, it began to come back to him in flashes. He begged the lawyer to not let them send him back to that solitary confinement cell. The lawyer said, "Unfortunately, if that's where they decide to keep you, that's where you'll be until you have your trial. And we have no idea when that trial is going to be. But stay strong. It's bound to be soon." Stephen stayed at the Institute for 2 weeks. During that time, he asked constantly about when his trial was going to happen, but nobody knew. And at the end of those 2 weeks, Stephen was abruptly taken from his room, put in a van, driven back to New Mexico, and put right back into his solitary confinement cell. Immediately, Stephen began to deteriorate again. He begged the guards not to put him back in there, but nobody was listening. And before long, the heavy steel door had shut, and he was all alone again. Within a couple of days, Stephen developed a painful abscess in one of his teeth. He tried to get medical attention, but he was ignored. So he sat in the corner of his cell, and for 8 straight hours one day, he rocked back and forth and violently twisted and yanked and pulled on that infected tooth until he was able to rip it out of his own head. Almost 2 months later, on the 22nd of June 2007, Stephen's case was finally put before a judge. The judge immediately dismissed all of the charges against him. It's believed the judge had found out about the horrible mistreatment Stephen had endured and took pity on him, but we will never know for sure. 3 days later, Stephen was released from jail and reunited with his family. He had been in solitary confinement for 2 years without so much as a single hearing to tell him what was going on with his case. He had essentially been completely forgotten about. He would go on to sue the county, and he won $15.5 million in damages. However, at the same time he was winning this case, he was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer and given less than a year to live. It is unclear if he is still alive today. 3 completely different stories, but they all show how fragile our own worlds can be. How a moment of extreme laziness, a terrible lapse in judgment during a contest, or a crack in the system that's supposed to protect us can change everything forever. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes the real horror isn't some external force, but the devastating consequences of very human decisions. 3 stories. 3 ordinary places. 3 decisions that never should have mattered until they did. Because what makes these stories unsettling isn't just what happened, it's how easily it all began. A small choice. A moment of carelessness. A system that didn't react in time. And suddenly, everything changed. Until next time. Obsession is a quiet, dangerous thing. It usually starts out harmlessly. Maybe it is a hobby you enjoy, a television show you love, or a dream you have been chasing since you were a kid. You think about it during your morning commute. You talk about it with your friends. But for some people, that interest slowly starts to twist. It becomes a hunger that cannot be satisfied by just thinking or talking. They need to feel it. They need to live it. They want to cross the invisible boundary that separates normal life from the darkest parts of human nature just to see what lies on the other side. And once that boundary is crossed, there is no going back. This is the story of a man who let his obsession drive him to build a real-life house of horrors, and the 2 unsuspecting men who walked right into it. To understand how this nightmare began, we have to look at a man named Mark Twitchell. Ever since he was a young boy growing up in Edmonton, Canada, Mark had one massive dream. He wanted to be a famous Hollywood filmmaker. He wanted his name to be known all over the world. But the problem was, Edmonton was not exactly a hotbed for the film industry. If you wanted to make movies, you usually had to go to Vancouver, Toronto, or down to Los Angeles. Mark did not do that. Instead, after high school, he decided to stay local. He enrolled in an Edmonton art college and graduated in the year 2000 with a degree in radio and television arts. He was convinced that this degree would be his ticket to stardom. But after graduation, reality set in. Mark made several short films, but none of them went anywhere. They were only watched by his close friends and supportive family members. For years, it seemed like his filmmaking career was going to be a complete dud. And so, it looked like Mark was destined for a quiet, unremarkable life. But then, in 2007, Mark had an unexpected breakthrough. He had been a massive Star Wars fan his entire life. He decided, purely as a passion project, to write a script for a prequel to the Star Wars franchise. When he finished the script, he showed it to his colleagues. They were absolutely blown away. They told him that the writing was incredible and that he needed to actually produce it. Mark was amazed by this positive feedback. He decided to take a huge gamble and produce the film. He began reaching out to various actors to see if they would be interested in playing a role. Amazingly, his script found its way to Jeremy Bulloch, the actor who played the iconic character Boba Fett in the original trilogy. Jeremy was so impressed by Mark's script that he agreed to fly to Edmonton and play a role in the film. When the movie was completed, it did not turn Mark into an overnight Hollywood celebrity, but it did put him on the map. He was now seen as a legitimate professional filmmaker. It taught him a powerful lesson. He realized that if he wanted to make successful films, he had to focus on subjects he was deeply, obsessively passionate about. Fast forward to 2008, Mark was looking for his next big project. At this time, he was completely obsessed with a television show called Dexter. The show was about a fictional serial killer who worked for the police department by day and hunted down bad guys by night. The way this character killed his victims was highly specific and methodical. He would set up what he called a kill room. He would find an isolated space like an empty room or a garage and cover every single surface with plastic sheeting. The ceiling, the walls, and the floor were all taped up in thick plastic to catch any blood and physical evidence. Then he would kill his victim, dismember the body, wrap the remains in the plastic sheeting to leave no trace behind, and dump everything into the deep ocean. Mark watched this show obsessively. He decided that his next movie had to be about a serial killer. But he did not want it to be pure fiction. He wanted it to feel incredibly real. At the time, there were rumors circulating in Edmonton about an uncaught killer who was targeting people in the city. Mark decided that this mysterious Edmonton killer would be the star of his movie. Mark spent several weeks doing intense research on real-life killers, their victims, and how police investigated these cases. He wanted his script to be mathematically perfect. He wanted every action, every reaction, and every emotion to feel authentic. He sat down and wrote a 42-page draft of a script, but then something strange happened. This draft somehow got leaked. When the contents of the script were read by people in the industry, it caused an immediate wave of shock and concern. The script was so graphic, so detailed, and so disturbing that it eventually landed on the desks of the Edmonton Police Department. The police read the script and were deeply alarmed. They contacted Mark and told him in no uncertain terms that he could not make this movie. They basically tried to wipe the script from existence. Today, you can only find heavily censored versions of it. But if you look at the uncensored version, you realize that the story Mark wrote was not a work of fiction at all. It was a step-by-step record of actual events. And to understand what was really in that script, we have to look at the lives of the ordinary men who crossed paths with Mark. In early October of the year 2008, a 26-year-old man named Giles Tetreault was living alone in Edmonton. Giles was a gentle, soft-spoken guy who worked as a security guard at a local casino. He was a hard worker and a good friend, but his personal life had recently been completely shattered. A few months earlier, his wife had sat him down and told him that she did not love him anymore. She packed her bags and left. Giles was still deeply in love with her, and this sudden rejection broke his heart. He tried to stay busy with work, but whenever he came home to his empty apartment, the silence was deafening. He felt a heavy, suffocating loneliness every single day. Finally, on Friday, October 3rd, Giles decided that he could not live like this anymore. He needed to try and move on. He went online and created a profile on a popular local dating website. He started scrolling through the profiles of women in the Edmonton area, hoping to find someone he could connect with. At first, none of the profiles caught his eye. But then, he stopped on a profile of a woman named Sheena. She was a beautiful, young, blonde woman who lived right in Edmonton. Giles took a deep breath and sent her a polite message to introduce himself. To his surprise, she responded just a few minutes later. Over the next couple of hours, the two of them exchanged dozens of messages. They talked about their lives, their interests, and their plans. Giles felt a spark of hope that he had not felt in months. He was finally smiling again. Eventually, Sheena sent a message saying that since they lived so close to each other, they should meet up that very night for dinner and a movie. Giles was thrilled. He immediately replied and asked for her address so he could come pick her up. But the problem was, Sheena did not want to give him her address. She explained that she felt uncomfortable sharing her actual home address with a stranger on a dating website. Giles understood this. It made sense for a woman to be cautious when meeting a man online. Instead of an address, Sheena sent him a highly specific, customized set of directions. She told him to follow a route of well-known local landmarks in a suburban neighborhood of Edmonton. She said that when he reached the final landmark, he would see a detached two-car garage in an alleyway. She said that one of the garage doors would be partially open. Giles was instructed to walk under the open garage door, walk straight through the garage, go out the back door, cross the backyard, and meet her at the back steps of her house. This was definitely a strange way to meet someone, but Giles rationalized it. He figured she was just taking extra safety precautions. He agreed to the plan, freshened up, got dressed in his nice clothes, and got into his truck. Giles followed the landmarks perfectly. After about 15 minutes of driving, he turned into a quiet alleyway in a suburban neighborhood. He looked to his right and saw the detached garage. Just like Sheena had said, one of the garage doors was open, though it was only raised about halfway. He would have to duck down to get inside. Giles parked his truck and stepped out. He tried to look over the top of the garage to see the house behind it, hoping to catch a glimpse of Sheena waiting for him, but the garage was blocking his view. He thought about how close he was to finally starting a new chapter in his life. He walked over to the open garage door, bent down, and stepped inside. As soon as he stood up inside, he realized it was pitch black. There were no lights on. But there was some light spilling in from the alley behind him, and as his eyes adjusted, he noticed something incredibly bizarre. Virtually every single surface of the garage was covered in thick plastic sheeting. The walls, the ceiling, and the concrete floor were all wrapped in plastic. Giles had no idea why a garage would be set up like this. He thought maybe she was doing some home renovations or painting. He did not let it bother him. He focused on the door at the back of the garage that led to the yard. He walked across the plastic-covered floor, reached out, and put his hand on the doorknob. But before he could turn it, a blinding, agonizing pain shot through the back of his neck. Giles whipped around in shock. Standing in the darkness right in front of him was a massive man wearing a black and gold hockey mask. The man was holding a heavy stun baton. Before Giles could even comprehend what was happening, the masked man lunged forward and rammed the stun baton directly into Giles's stomach, pulling the trigger. The electrical current surged through Giles's body. He collapsed onto the plastic floor, his muscles locking up in agony. The attacker let go of the trigger, and Giles, driven by sheer survival instinct, scrambled to his feet and tried to run toward the exit. But when he turned around, he stopped, dead in his tracks. The masked man was blocking the only way out, and he was now holding a handgun, pointing it directly at Giles's head. The masked man barked at Giles to get on the ground and put his face down. Giles was completely terrified. He knew he was defenseless, so he complied. He lay down on his stomach on the cold plastic sheeting. The attacker walked over, pulled out a roll of heavy duct tape, and placed a thick strip of tape over Giles's eyes, blinding him. As Giles lay there in the dark, his mind began to race. He thought about his ex-wife. He thought about his parents and his friends. He realized with absolute horror that he had not told a single person where he was going tonight. If this man killed him right here, no one would ever know where to look. He would simply vanish off the face of the earth. Then he heard the metallic sound of chains or handcuffs being rattled nearby. Giles realized that if he allowed himself to be bound, he would never leave this garage alive. He decided that if he was going to die, he was going to die fighting. With a sudden, massive surge of adrenaline, Giles ripped the duct tape off his eyes, jumped to his feet, and faced his attacker. He yelled that he was not going to do this. The masked man was startled, but he quickly raised his gun. Giles lunged forward and grabbed the barrel of the weapon, twisting it away from his body. As soon as his hand touched the gun, he realized something incredible. The gun was made of lightweight plastic. It was a fake. This realization gave Giles a massive boost of confidence. He grabbed the attacker's arms and tried to trip him, but the masked man was much larger and stronger. The man delivered a brutal headbutt right to Giles's face. Giles fell to the ground, and the attacker jumped on top of him, raining down heavy punches and slamming his head against the concrete floor repeatedly. But Giles was so high on adrenaline that he barely felt the pain. He struggled wildly, twisting and turning, until he managed to wriggle out from under the giant. He scrambled toward the half-open garage door, but the attacker grabbed him by his jacket. Giles twisted his body, slipped right out of his jacket, and rolled under the garage door into the alley. He was free, but his legs suddenly felt like lead. The effect of the stun baton was finally catching up to him, and he collapsed onto the dirt. Before he could crawl away, the attacker's hand reached out from under the garage door, grabbed Giles by the ankle, and began dragging him back inside. Giles kicked wildly with his free leg, screaming for help at the top of his lungs. He managed to break the grip, got to his feet, and ran down the alleyway. He ran past his truck, too terrified to stop and look for his keys. He ran until he reached a paved walking path where he collapsed, exhausted and bleeding. Just then, he saw a young couple walking toward him. Giles pointed down the alleyway and screamed that a man was trying to kill him. But then, the masked man walked right out of the alley. He was still wearing the hockey mask, but he walked with a calm, casual stride. He walked right up to Giles and the couple. He did not look panicked at all. Instead, he chuckled and said that Giles was just making a big deal out of a harmless game. He called Giles by the name Frank and told him to stop messing around and come back to the garage. The couple looked at Giles, who was covered in dirt and blood, and then looked at the giant in the hockey mask. They were completely confused and terrified. They did not know if this was a robbery setup, a prank, or a domestic dispute. They told Giles that they did not want any part of this, and they walked away, leaving him completely alone with his attacker. Giles lay on the ground, watching the couple disappear. He looked back at the masked man, who turned around and walked back down the alley toward the garage. Giles realized this was his only chance. He waited a few moments, gathered all the strength he had left, and dragged himself back to his truck. He jumped inside, locked the doors, started the engine, and sped away. When he finally got back to his apartment, he was shaking with fear and adrenaline. But as the hours passed, another feeling washed over him. He felt incredibly embarrassed. He realized he had been completely fooled by a fake online dating profile. He had been lured into a trap by a lunatic. He convinced himself that since he had escaped, and since he did not actually know who the man was, there was no point in involving the police. He was ashamed, and so he decided to keep the entire terrifying ordeal a secret. He resolved to never speak of it again and try to move on with his life. But the problem was, the monster in the garage was not done. Exactly 1 week later, on Wednesday, October 8th, another Edmonton resident was looking for love online. Johnny Altinger was 38 years old and worked as a quality control inspector for an oil and gas company. It was a stable job, but Johnny did not particularly enjoy it. He was a tech enthusiast who loved spending his free time building computers and riding his prized motorcycle. He was a popular guy with a large circle of close friends, but he had always struggled to find a stable romantic relationship. That afternoon, Johnny decided to try his luck on the very same dating website that Giles had used. As he scrolled through the profiles, he came across a woman named Jen. She was a beautiful, young blonde who seemed incredibly friendly. Johnny sent her a message, and she replied almost instantly. The two of them hit it off immediately. They messaged back and forth for hours, laughing and sharing stories. Eventually, Jen suggested that they meet up that night for a date. But when Johnny asked for her address, she gave him the exact same excuse that Sheena had given Giles. She said she was paranoid about safety and did not want to give her address to a stranger. Instead, she sent him a highly specific set of directions based on local landmarks. She told him to drive to a suburban neighborhood, find a detached garage with a partially open door in an alleyway, and walk through it to the backyard. Johnny thought this was highly unusual, but he was excited about the date and did not want to ruin his chances. However, Johnny was a cautious man. Before he left his apartment, he took the email containing the strange directions and forwarded it to one of his best friends, a man named Bobby Woodard. Johnny attached a lighthearted note that said, in case he went missing tonight, this was where he was going. Then he got into his car and drove off. The directions led Johnny to the exact same suburban alleyway and the exact same detached garage. When he arrived, he noticed that the lights inside the garage were on and he could see the silhouette of someone moving around. Johnny checked his watch and realized he was about 15 minutes early. He figured Jen might be getting things ready, so he decided to walk over and introduce himself. As he approached the partially open garage door, the lights inside suddenly went out. Johnny paused, confused, but then walked up to the door, ducked down, and called out a greeting. The lights flickered back on. Inside, the garage was empty except for a table, and every single wall and ceiling was covered in plastic sheeting. Standing in the back of the room was a man Johnny did not recognize. The man did not have a mask on. He smiled warmly and introduced himself as Harry. He claimed he was a designer who rented the garage space from Jen. Harry told Johnny that Jen was running a little bit late and would be back in about 20 minutes. He suggested that Johnny drive around for a bit and come back then, and Harry would personally walk him up to the house. Johnny agreed, got back in his car, and drove away. 20 minutes later, Johnny returned to the alley. The lights in the garage were now off. Johnny assumed that Harry had left, which actually made him feel more comfortable, as he did not really want to deal with a strange designer. He parked his car, walked to the garage, ducked under the door, and stepped onto the plastic-covered floor. He began walking toward the back door that led to the yard. But before he could reach it, a massive blow struck him from behind, hitting him squarely in the back of the head. Johnny stumbled forward, his head spinning in pain. He raised his hands to protect himself and turned around. Through the shadows, he saw Harry standing there, holding a heavy metal pipe. Johnny began screaming for help, shouting for the police, but Harry did not stop. He swung the pipe again and again, striking Johnny repeatedly until Johnny collapsed onto the plastic sheeting covered in blood. As Johnny lay there, battered and weak, he looked up at Harry and pleaded for his life. He told Harry that he would give him all of his money, anything he wanted, if he would just let him go. Harry looked down at him, smiled, and asked if Johnny promised not to tell anyone if he let him go. But before Johnny could answer, Harry brought the metal pipe down hard on Johnny's face. Johnny, driven by pure survival instinct, managed to grab the end of the pipe, holding onto it with all of his remaining strength to prevent another blow. Harry grew frustrated that this man was still fighting back. He reached down to his hip, unsheathed a heavy hunting knife, and held the blade right in front of Johnny's eyes. Johnny froze in terror and let go of the pipe, begging for mercy. Harry pulled the knife back and plunged it deep into Johnny's stomach. Johnny let out a horrific scream. Harry then drove the knife into the side of Johnny's neck, holding it there until Johnny stopped moving and bled out onto the plastic. As Harry stood over the lifeless body of Johnny Altinger, he did not feel remorse. Instead, he felt a strange disappointment. He thought to himself that he should have played more psychological mind games with his victim before killing him, and he resolved to do that with his next target. Harry then proceeded to systematically dismember Johnny's body. He placed the remains into heavy plastic bags, rolled up all of the plastic sheeting from the walls and ceiling to trap any remaining forensic evidence, and loaded everything into the trunk of his car. A couple of days later, he drove to a nearby storm drain and dumped Johnny's body parts and the plastic down into the sewer system. But the problem was, Johnny Altinger was a man with a tight-knit group of friends who cared about him deeply. When Johnny did not show up for work the next day and did not answer any phone calls or text messages, his friends immediately knew something was wrong. They went to his apartment and found his prized motorcycle parked outside. Johnny would never leave his motorcycle behind if he was going somewhere. Then, some of his friends received very strange emails from Johnny's account. The emails stated that he had met an incredible woman named Jen and that they had impulsively decided to pack their bags and go on a long vacation to Costa Rica together. The email said he would send for his things later. But his friends were highly suspicious. Johnny was a computer expert who wrote with flawless grammar, and these emails were littered with spelling mistakes and unusual phrasing. Furthermore, he would never just abandon his life and his friends for a stranger. At this point, Bobby Woodard remembered the email that from Johnny had forwarded to him on the night of his disappearance. He found the email with the highly specific landmark-based directions to the garage. Bobby immediately took this email to the Edmonton Police Department. The detectives recognized the gravity of the situation. They followed the exact landmark directions listed in the email, weaving through the suburban streets until they arrived at the detached garage in the alleyway. They ran the property records and discovered that the garage was being rented by a young local filmmaker named Mark Twitchell. The police contacted Mark, and he agreed to meet with them right away. He was incredibly polite, calm, and cooperative. He explained to the detectives that he was an independent filmmaker and that he had rented the garage to use as a set for a movie he was shooting. He even showed them his equipment and props, explaining that the movie was a horror film about a serial killer. He claimed he had never met anyone named Johnny Altinger. But then, the detectives made a highly suspicious discovery. They found Johnny's red passenger car parked on a residential street remarkably close to Mark Twitchell's residence. When they asked Mark about the vehicle, he had a very convenient story ready to go. He claimed that a few days earlier, an unknown man had approached him on the street out of nowhere and offered to sell him the car for an incredibly low price because he was moving out of the country immediately and needed quick cash. Mark claimed he bought the car on the spot with cash. The detectives did not buy this bizarre story for a single second. They immediately obtained search warrants for Mark's home, his vehicle, and the rented garage. Even though the garage had been thoroughly cleaned and scrubbed down, forensic investigators used specialized chemical sprays like luminol, and they found significant traces of human blood on the floor. But the most damning piece of evidence was found when digital forensic experts began analyzing Mark's personal laptop. Deep within the hard drive, examiners recovered a deleted 42-page document. The document was titled SK Confessions. The letters SK stood for serial killer. The document did not read like a normal movie script. It began with a chilling statement explaining that this was the real-life record of the author's progression into becoming an actual serial killer. As the detectives read through the pages, their jaws dropped. The document detailed, step by step, how the author had set up a garage with plastic sheeting to create a perfect kill room, just like the character in the television show Dexter. It described how the author used a fake female profile on a dating website to lure a man to the garage. It described the first victim, a casino security guard who had fought back with incredible strength, realized the gun was fake, slipped out of his jacket, and managed to escape down the alley. The document even detailed how the author had chased the man into the street and convinced a passing couple that it was all just a harmless game, calling the victim Frank. The police realized that this document was not a work of fiction. It was an incredibly detailed diary of real crimes. They immediately searched their databases for any reports of an assault matching this description, but they found nothing because Giles Tetreault had been too embarrassed to report it. However, they managed to track Giles down. When detectives sat him down and asked him about that night, Giles finally broke his silence and told them everything. His real-life experience matched the recovered document perfectly, down to the smallest detail. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The police realized that Mark Twitchell was not just a filmmaker writing about a killer. He had actually become the killer. He wanted to experience the act of murder firsthand so that he could write about it with absolute authenticity. He believed this twisted dedication to his craft would make his movie a masterpiece and launch his Hollywood career. Mark Twitchell was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and attempted murder. His trial in 2011 became one of the most highly publicized and sensational cases in Canadian history. During the trial, the prosecution presented the SK Confessions document as a literal step-by-step diary of Johnny Altinger's murder. Mark took the stand in his own defense. He tried to claim that the document was a clever mix of fact and fiction designed to generate publicity for his upcoming film. He admitted to killing Johnny Altinger, but claimed it was a tragic accident. He argued that Johnny had become angry and attacked him when he realized the date was a setup and that Mark had only defended himself, but the jury did not believe his lies. The overwhelming physical evidence, the plastic-lined room, the fake dating profiles, and the testimony of Giles Tetreault proved beyond any doubt that this was a cold, calculated, and highly premeditated murder. The jury found Mark Twitchell guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. This case leaves a deep, lingering chill. It makes us realize how incredibly thin the line can be between imagination and real-world evil. Johnny Altinger was just an ordinary man looking for connection, and his life was brutally stolen by a man who valued fame and artistic authenticity over human life. But Johnny's final smart act of sending those directions to his friend ultimately brought down a monster and saved countless other innocent lives. And for Giles Tetreault, the survivor, the memory of that dark garage and the hand grabbing his ankle will always remain a haunting reminder of how close he came to vanishing forever. This case is a reminder that obsession doesn't always look dangerous until it crosses a line you can never come back from. Johnny didn't get a second chance. Giles barely did. If you want to dive deeper into stories like this, there's more waiting for you. Until next time. Somewhere deep in a forest in France, a girl began to realize something was wrong. At first, it was just the sound of a bell ringing somewhere between the trees, and every time she stopped to listen, it would disappear like it was never there at all. But the deeper she went into the forest, the more certain she became of one thing. Something was there with her just out of sight. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella was finishing up her first year of college. She was excited to head home for the summer. Her family lived on the outskirts of a small town in France, a place tucked away in the mountains and almost completely surrounded by a massive, dense forest. Growing up there, Bella had spent a huge amount of her childhood exploring that forest. Sometimes she would go by herself, other times with her father, or maybe with her cousins. Over the years, she had come to know the woods like the back of her hand. She knew every trail, every landmark, every quiet little spot. Her absolute favorite place in this entire forest was a small, man-made lake that was situated deep inside, almost at the very center of the woods. It wasn't a very large lake, but the view was breathtaking, and it was always incredibly peaceful. It was her go-to spot to clear her head. Getting there was a little ritual she had perfected over the years. She would leave her house, get into her small car, and drive for a couple of miles down a quiet country road. At a very specific, unmarked spot, she would pull over onto the gravel shoulder. There were no signs, no designated parking area. It was just a place she and her family had discovered, a hidden gateway to their part of the forest. After parking, she'd get out, and instead of walking along the road, she would turn and walk directly into the line of trees that grew right up against the shoulder. The underbrush was thick for the first few feet, but it quickly opened up into a small clearing. Just ahead, she would see a little stream trickling through the woods. To the left of this stream, there was what looked like a worn-out footpath, but it wasn't a human trail. It was an animal trail, a path carved out over years and years by deer and other wildlife making their way through the forest. Bella would walk down to this animal path and follow it as it ran parallel to the stream. She'd walk for about 15 or 20 minutes, just enjoying the quiet sounds of nature, until the path took a sharp turn to the left, heading away from the water. At that point, Bella would leave the animal trail behind. She'd continue walking straight, following the stream north, deeper and deeper into the heart of the forest. This part of the journey involved stepping carefully on mossy rocks in the stream and walking along the muddy banks on either side. It was a slower pace, and it would take her about an hour of steady walking before the stream eventually met up with a much larger river that ran from east to west. When she reached this river, Bella would turn left, heading west, and follow the riverbank for another 20 minutes or so. And then, finally, the river would open up and feed directly into her destination, the man-made lake. She would find a comfortable rock to sit on, watch the animals, listen to the wind in the trees, and just feel totally at peace. To get back, she would just retrace her steps exactly. The whole trip, one way, from her car to the lake, took about 2 hours. A big part of why Bella loved this place so much was because it felt like it belonged to her and her family. In all her years of coming out here, the only other people she had ever seen in this part of the forest or anywhere near the lake were members of her own family. It was their secret, their private sanctuary. So, in June of that year, when Bella finally came home from college, one of the first things she wanted to do was go out to the lake. She hadn't been in months because of school, and she was really missing her happy place. One morning, she got up early, told her parents where she was headed, and set out by herself. She got in her car, drove the familiar couple of miles, and pulled over onto the gravel shoulder. She got out, turned away from the road, and walked into the forest. She found the stream, then the animal path beside it. She walked for a few minutes until the trail cut to the left, and just as she always did, she stayed with the stream, continuing her journey north. About 30 minutes later, when she was still a good mile or two away from the east-west river, she heard something. It was a bell. Somewhere off in the distance, far ahead of her, she heard a single, clear chime. As soon as she heard it, she stopped dead in her tracks. That was wrong. There were never any people out here. Ever. And that sound, a bell, had to come from a person or something a person had made. She stood perfectly still, listening, wondering if she had imagined it. It could have just been a strange sound, her mind playing tricks on her in the silence of the woods. She waited. And then she heard it again. But this time, it wasn't a single chime. The bell started ringing continuously. It wasn't a steady, rhythmic ringing, though. It was sporadic and uneven, almost frantic, like someone holding a bell and just shaking it randomly at a sports game. Her mind started racing, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe a dog had gotten lost out here, and it had a bell on its collar. But as she listened, she realized the sound was too loud, too resonant. It wasn't the tiny jingle of a pet's bell. This was something bigger, more substantial. She thought of other, stranger possibilities. Maybe someone had a bell in a box, and the box fell into the river upstream and was now floating down, hitting rocks and causing the sound. She was coming up with all these weird scenarios, but honestly, she wasn't scared. She was just incredibly curious. Since the sound of the bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already heading, she decided to just keep walking. She wanted to see for herself what was making that noise. So Bella started walking along the stream again, her ears tuned to the constant random ringing up ahead. She was completely focused on it, trying to pinpoint its exact location. And then, after about 5 more minutes of walking, the bell just stopped. It went completely silent. The sudden absence of the sound was actually more startling than the sound itself. She stopped again, listening intently, expecting it to start up again, but it didn't. All she could hear now were the normal sounds of the forest, the stream, the birds, the wind. Bella had no explanation for the bell or why it had stopped, but she wasn't really worried about it. She figured there had to be a logical explanation for it, even if she couldn't think of one. So she just shrugged it off, put her focus back on her hike, and kept walking toward the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still making her way along the stream. She was getting closer to the East-West River, maybe only a half-mile away now. That's when she saw something up ahead on the left bank of the stream. It was a dark lump on the ground. At first, she couldn't tell what it was. It could have been a strangely shaped rock or maybe an animal. As she got closer, she realized it was a beaver lying motionless on the ground, and this beaver was missing its head. Now, this was a huge forest, and Bella knew perfectly well that it was full of wild animals. Finding the body of an animal that had been killed by a predator wasn't unusual. That was just nature. But as she stood over it, something struck her as deeply wrong. The cut on the beaver's neck was incredibly neat and uniform. It looked like its head had been very carefully removed with an extremely sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere in sight. This definitely didn't look like the work of a predator. The teeth and claws of an animal would have left a ragged, torn mess. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was completely untouched. Whatever had killed it clearly wasn't interested in eating it. As Bella stood there staring down at the bizarre sight, she also noticed there was no smell. Usually, when an animal dies, the process of decomposition starts quickly and it creates a very distinct odor. The lack of any smell told Bella that this beaver must have been killed very, very recently. Then she gently nudged the body with the toe of her shoe and saw that it was still fairly limp. Rigor mortis, the stiffening of the body that happens shortly after death, hadn't set in yet. As all these facts clicked into place in her mind, a cold realization washed over her. This beaver had died only a short time ago, which meant that whoever or whatever had killed it was probably still somewhere nearby. And then Bella couldn't help but connect the dead beaver to the bell she had heard earlier. Before, the bell was just a curiosity. But now, considering the sound had come from the same general area where this freshly killed and decapitated beaver was now lying, it made her deeply uneasy. Her head snapped up, and she found herself frantically scanning the trees, her eyes darting in every direction. She was looking for a person, maybe a hunter, someone who could explain what was going on. But she saw nothing. There was no movement, no sound, just the dense, silent woods. She felt a wave of panic begin to rise in her chest, but she forced herself to stop. She took a deep breath and told herself to calm down. It was broad daylight. She had been coming to these woods her entire life and had never seen another person, never had a dangerous encounter with an animal. She was sure everything was fine. She had to be overreacting. She had nothing to worry about. So she took another deep breath, carefully stepped over the beaver's body, and kept on walking. Eventually, Bella reached the East-West River. She made the left turn and walked the final 20 minutes along its bank until she reached the man-made lake. She sat for a while, enjoying the beautiful view and the familiar scenery, trying to push the image of the beaver out of her mind. After some time, she got up, turned around, and began the long walk back. She passed the spot where the beaver was still lying on the ground, walked all the way back to her car, and went home, feeling a little unsettled, but mostly okay. A week went by. Bella was at home feeling bored and restless. On an impulse, she decided that the only cure for her boredom was a trip back to the place she loved most, the man-made lake. She told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house. It was already 6 p.m. when she got in her car, drove to the pull-off, parked, and entered the woods. Sunset that night was at 9, so Bella knew she couldn't linger. This would have to be a quick trip if she wanted to avoid being caught in the forest after dark. She found the animal trail and started her journey along the stream. She followed it until the trail veered left, and then she continued along the stream bed. As she was walking, she started to hear the distant rumble of thunder. She looked up through the canopy of leaves and could see the sky was growing dark, much darker than it should be. It was still a couple of hours before sunset, so she knew a storm was rolling in. But Bella was determined. She was not going to turn back. She wanted to get to that lake. So instead of heading back to her car, she did the opposite. She started jogging along the stream, trying to get there as fast as she possibly could. Almost as soon as she picked up her pace, the first raindrops began to fall. By the time she passed the spot where the beaver corpse had been lying on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. About 15 minutes after she passed the corpse, she finally reached the East-West River. By this point, the rain had turned into a full-blown downpour. Still, Bella was resolute. She turned left at the river and continued west, intending to go all the way to the lake. But after only a minute or two of walking along the river, with about 20 minutes still left to go, she stopped herself. She looked at her watch and saw that it was already after 8 o'clock. She started thinking it through logically. If she turned around right now, it would still take her over an hour to get back to her car. Sunset was at 9. It was already past 8. That meant, best case scenario, she was going to have to navigate the last part of her journey in the dark. And if she went all the way to the lake first, then she would be walking in the pitch black forest for maybe up to an hour. She was confident she could probably do it, but it was also pouring rain and she was cold and soaked. If she got lost or twisted an ankle, this could turn into a very bad situation very quickly. So, as much as she wanted to keep going, she made the sensible decision. She needed to turn around and head back. She turned and began walking back along the East-West River toward the spot where the stream fed into it. She turned south and started making her way along the stream back toward her car. Because it was getting so dark and the rain was so heavy, visibility was terrible. She kept her head down, watching the ground, trying not to trip. She was carefully placing her feet on rocks and muddy patches, making sure her footing was solid. The rain was pounding all around her. She had been walking like this for about 15 minutes when, all of a sudden, something hit her hard on the top of her head. Reflexively, she cried out and looked up, throwing her hands in front of her face to protect herself. And then she saw what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string, dangling from a tree branch directly over the path. And its head, which had been missing before, had been found. It had been crudely stitched onto the beaver's own front paws. So she was looking at this grotesque dangling puppet of a beaver carrying its own head, and she had walked right into it. Her first reaction was to gag. She felt like she was going to vomit right there. She was so disgusted. Then she started frantically rubbing at her hair where the wet, decomposing thing had touched her, terrified that some fluid from it had gotten on her. After a moment of panicked scrubbing, she stopped. And something truly terrifying dawned on her. Whoever had strung this beaver up in this tree and had taken the time to stitch its head onto its paws had done it in the last 30 minutes. Because just 30 minutes earlier, on her way in, she specifically remembered seeing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It was in the same spot it had been a week ago. And now, here it was, hanging from a tree. As the wheels turned in her head, Bella came to a chilling conclusion. If someone had just done this, then that someone was probably still here. They were probably nearby. At this point, it was getting really dark. The rain was hammering down, and she felt completely exposed. She started whipping her head around, trying to peer through the downpour into the dark woods, searching for anyone who might have done this. but all she could see was the dark, blurry shape of the forest in every direction. She knew she was at least an hour away from her car, even if she ran. Suddenly, she was totally and completely panicked. In a desperate effort to calm herself down, she whispered to herself, "Okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running, I'll fall, I'll get lost, this will turn into a nightmare. Just walk. Try to walk." So she took a shaky breath, walked around the dangling beaver corpse, and started moving along the stream again. But as soon as she was past it, she felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She could hear movement behind her. A rustling sound. She didn't know what it was. It could have been a deer, just some animal startled by the storm. But she was far too afraid to turn around and look. And even though she was telling herself to stay calm, to just keep walking, that she was safe and just freaking herself out, she could feel her pace quickening. Her walk turned into a jog, and then finally she broke into a full-on sprint, running down the stream away from that beaver and whatever was moving in the trees behind her. At some point, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing the beaver, she was so out of breath from sprinting that she had to slow down to a walk. As soon as she slowed down, still without turning around, she heard it again. The sound of that bell. It was the exact same sound she had heard the week before, that constant, sporadic ringing. But in her panicked state, she couldn't tell where it was coming from. Her anxiety was so high, her heart was pounding so loud, she didn't know if it was behind her, or to the side, or all around her. It was now completely dark, and she was full-blown terrified. There was someone or something behind her, the person who had strung up that beaver, and they were probably watching her right now. Even though she was beyond exhausted and could barely breathe, she started sprinting again as fast as her legs would carry her. She stumbled and fell on the slippery rocks, she tripped over roots, not even looking where she was going anymore. And in the background, all around her, she could hear that bell chiming, and she could hear something crashing through the woods behind her. She fumbled in her pocket and pulled out her iPhone. As she was running, she managed to dial her father. She pressed the phone to her ear, crying, panting, gasping for air. Her father picked up, and she was so relieved to hear his voice, but she couldn't even form a sentence. She just started wailing, pleading with him. "Dad, come out to the forest! Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest, they're chasing me, and I can't see them." Her father, on the other end of the line, didn't know what to make of it, but he could hear the pure primal fear in his daughter's voice. He didn't waste time with questions. He just said, "Stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now." Bella's father and mother, with Bella still on the phone with them, ran out of their house. They jumped in their car and sped the couple of miles down the road. They parked next to their daughter's car, and as they were getting out, they could hear it. Way off in the woods, they could hear the faint sound of the bell. They could hear their daughter screaming on the phone, and they could hear that same bell sound coming through the phone's speaker. She was begging them, "Please, come into the woods, come in here, save me." Her parents ran into the woods and started charging up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella was still deep in the forest, still 10 or 15 minutes away from them. She could barely run anymore. She had used up almost all of her energy. And as she got closer and closer to where her parents would be, the sporadic ringing of the bell was getting louder and louder and louder. Whatever it was gaining on her. She could hear sticks and branches snapping right behind her, as if something was just feet away. Finally, when it felt like the bell was ringing right behind her head, she just stopped. It was a moment of complete defeat. She was too far away from her parents. She wasn't going to make it to them in time. It was almost as if she felt she had no choice but to turn around and finally see whatever it was that was hunting her. So, terrified beyond words, so scared and so tired she could barely breathe, Bella slowly turned around. When she turned, she found herself facing a small clearing she had just run past. Because it was a clearing, a little bit of moonlight was able to filter down through the trees, just enough to illuminate the space, which was about 50 feet across. As she looked across this clearing, at first she saw nothing. And then a tall, dark figure walked into the clearing from the trees on the other side. As soon as it stepped into the faint light, she could see it had a bell tied at its waist. With every single step it took, its leg would strike the bell, causing that violent ringing sound. This thing started moving across the clearing, and as Bella stared at it, it was like time slowed down. She couldn't process what she was seeing. She didn't know what it was. All she knew was that whatever or whoever this was, it was coming straight for her. And then, suddenly, Bella felt an unbelievable rush of adrenaline. It was like her body went into autopilot, a pure survival instinct. She turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her entire life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now understood was the sound of its steps. The bell was getting faster and faster, louder and louder. She knew it was gaining on her. She started screaming out loud, lying, "I'm on the phone with the police! They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any second." But whatever was behind her wasn't fazed. It just kept charging forward, closing the distance second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot. But her father couldn't just stand there and wait. He started charging deeper into the woods towards the sounds. He could hear his daughter's screams, he could hear the bell getting louder and louder, and he just ran straight towards it. And sure enough, just seconds later, he saw his daughter compounding out of the dark forest. She saw him and leaped into his arms. He grabbed her, turned around, and ran with her back to the meeting spot. He grabbed his wife, and the three of them just charged out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back into their car. And they sped away. In the car, all of them were crying. They had no idea what to make of what had just happened. Bella was trying to describe what she saw, but she couldn't get the words out. Her parents had been on the phone listening to their daughter's terrified screams, and all they kept saying to each other was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell." That sound confirmed their worst nightmares. There really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to harm their child. They drove straight to the police station, where Bella filed a report about everything she had experienced in the forest. Afterwards, as a precaution, her parents took her to the hospital. She was determined to be physically okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling. The following morning, the police went out to the forest. They went to the area Bella had described and conducted a thorough search all along the animal trail and the stream. But they never found any sign of this tall, dark figure with the bell. Bella had told the police that she was carrying a handbag and that she had dropped it while she was running. She remembered exactly where along the stream she had dropped it, but when the police searched that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It wasn't tied to the tree, and it wasn't on the ground. It had vanished. The only thing the police found that was out of the ordinary was a t-shirt. A little ways off from the stream, basically along the path Bella would have been running, they found a t-shirt that was neatly folded and placed carefully underneath a rock. But the police, Bella and her family, had no idea what that was supposed to mean. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she had run into was some kind of mentally unstable person who was living out in the woods. Perhaps when Bella came into the forest, this person felt like she was trespassing on their property, and so they tried to scare her away. But Bella has a very hard time accepting that explanation. She felt with every fiber of her being that as she was running from whoever was behind her, she was in mortal danger. She believes that if her father hadn't run into the woods and literally grabbed her and carried her the rest of the way, she might not have gotten out of there at all. She might have been attacked and killed by whatever that was. And when she looks back on the experience, she can't help but think about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing. When she saw that figure step into the moonlight for the first time, she remembers that the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal. They were abnormal, disjointed. There was something so off about its movement that for a second, it didn't even seem like she was looking at a person, but maybe some kind of large animal. Since her ordeal, there have been no other strange sightings reported in those woods. But then again, almost no one ever goes into that part of the forest except for Bella and her family. And Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. The police never found anyone or anything in that forest. No trace of the shadow. No trace of the beaver. Nothing. It's just an empty forest and the sound of a bell that no one can fully explain. To this day, Bella and her family refuse to ever go near that forest again. Because anything out there has never proven that it has left. Just before 8:00 the evening on the 3rd of September, 1981, a 31-year-old woman named Linda Slayton stood in her small kitchen in Lakeland, Florida. She was staring into her cupboard, and what she saw was not encouraging. The shelves were nearly bare. There were a couple of cans of beans, a bag of flour, and not much else. And seeing this sight, this emptiness, it gave Linda a familiar pit in her stomach. It was the feeling of knowing she had to somehow stretch these very few ingredients into a real, filling meal for her 2 growing boys. Linda was a single mother. She had 2 sons, Jeff, who was 15, and Tim, who was 12. And to say money was tight would be an understatement. Linda didn't have much at all. So, in order to make sure her kids were taken care of, she had to be incredibly resourceful. She had to be creative. This meant doing things like finding a way to make a real dinner out of just beans and flour. It also meant she would often make her kids, their clothes, herself, anything she could do to save a few dollars here and there. It was a constant struggle, but she did it for them. Up until just a few weeks ago, the family had been living in Alabama. But Linda had made the big decision to move them all to Lakeland, Florida. And she did this for a very specific reason. She had a lot of family and a strong support system there. Her sister lived there, her parents were nearby. And so Linda had really been hoping that with all that support, things would finally start to look up for her and her sons. She hoped their lives would improve, that it wouldn't feel like such a constant, grinding struggle all the time anymore. But so far, the big move to Lakeland had just felt like more of the same. The fresh start hadn't quite materialized yet. Linda was having a hard time finding a steady job, which was the cornerstone of her plan. So, in the meantime, she and the boys were getting by on government assistance and food stamps. But it never seemed to be enough. Especially not enough to keep 2 teenage boys, one of whom was an athlete, well-fed, and happy. And tonight was a perfect example of that pressure. Her youngest son, Tim, was due to be dropped off any minute. He had been at football practice, and Linda knew from experience that when he came home from practice, he was always starving. So she really, really wanted to have a hot dinner ready and waiting for him when he walked through the door. On top of that, there was another reason she wanted to get dinner done quickly. Linda was hopeful that if Tim and her other son Jeff ate fast enough, they would all have enough time to make it over to a neighbor's housewarming party later that evening. You see, all the neighbors in their new complex were basically as new as she was. The entire housing development had only been open for about 3 weeks. It was a big, sprawling development with around 81-story duplexes. Technically, it was government-subsidized housing, but it didn't really feel like it. It had more of a classic suburban feel. The units were arranged on quiet cul-de-sacs with neat little lawns where all the neighborhood kids would go outside and play together. It felt safe. It felt like a community. Linda's own sister, Judy, also lived in this same complex, which was a huge comfort. So Linda already knew at least one person very well. But for Linda, making friends of her own was also really important. She was an outgoing, friendly person by nature, and she was also newly single. She wanted to meet people and take her mind off her recent ex-boyfriend. Until just a little while ago, Linda had been dating a guy named Brendan Fowler. He had been really great at first. In fact, he was the one who had told her about this apartment complex in the first place. But over time, he'd started to get really controlling and possessive. It became suffocating. And just 2 days ago, Linda had finally gathered the strength to end things with him for good. And believe it or not, despite the empty cupboards and the job hunt, Linda was actually feeling sort of hopeful. She had believed that leaving Alabama and moving to Florida into this new complex, that this would be the big refresh that she and her kids so desperately needed. But now, she was starting to think that maybe the true reset, the real start, was the breakup with Brendan just a couple of days earlier. It was like all these big changes needed to happen together in order for their lives to really get on the right track. She felt like she was finally shedding all the old baggage. So, feeling a little bit optimistic, Linda looked back into the cupboard at her very limited ingredients. And suddenly, an idea sparked. She could actually make a quick bean casserole with just these few things. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be hot and filling. So she reached in, grabbed the cans and the bag of flour, set them on the counter, and she got to work. About a half an hour later, the smell of baking filled the small duplex. Linda pulled a beautiful golden brown casserole out of the oven and set it on the counter to cool down. And that's when her older son, Jeff, wandered into the kitchen. He saw the casserole and immediately asked if dinner was ready. Linda told him it was, but she explained that they needed to wait for his brother Tim to get home from football practice first before they could all eat together. And when she said that, something in Jeff just snapped. He sort of blew up at her. He said he was really hungry right now, and he complained that there was basically no other food in the house, so he couldn't even grab a snack to tide himself over. He just kept saying, "Come on, let me eat now." Now, Jeff's reaction made Linda pretty mad. But at the same time, it didn't really surprise her. He was 15, and he had been talking back to her a lot lately. It seemed like the two of them were fighting all the time over small things. Linda knew, deep down, that he was sort of just being a typical teenager. And he was really hungry, she got that. He was testing her limits. But she was just getting so tired of the constant conflict. And so before she could even really think about what she was saying, she snapped right back at him. She said, "Well, if you don't like it here, you can leave." And at that, Jeff didn't hesitate. He literally stormed out of the house and slammed the front door shut behind him. The sound echoed through the quiet duplex. Linda went over to the front window and watched as her son grabbed his bike from the lawn and pedaled off angrily down the road, disappearing around the corner. After he was gone, Linda let out a long sigh. She walked over to her phone and she called her mom. She assumed, correctly, that Jeff would probably head straight to his grandparents' house since they lived nearby. And when Linda's mother picked up the phone, Linda warned her that Jeff might be showing up soon and that he would probably be hungry and looking to eat. Her mom said that was perfectly fine, not to worry, and that they would make sure he had dinner and then drop him back off at home afterwards. Then her mom's tone changed. She said she was actually glad that Linda had called because another letter had arrived in the mail for her. And as soon as Linda heard the word letter, she felt this cold wave of anxiety wash over her. She knew exactly what kind of letter her mother was talking about. Linda's ex-husband, the father of Tim and Jeff, was a man named Frank Slayton. He still lived back in Alabama. He was a violent, abusive alcoholic, and they had been divorced for 7 long years. But even after all that time, Frank had never stopped harassing Linda. He just wouldn't let go. And ever since Linda and the boys had moved to Lakeland, he had started mailing these threatening letters to Linda's parents' house. In them, he would ramble on about how Linda had ruined his life. And so now, Linda was standing there on the phone, thinking that no matter how many fresh starts she tried to create for her family, it seemed like Frank was always going to find a way to screw them up. He was a dark cloud that was never going to go away. And so, after taking a deep, calming breath, Linda told her mom on the phone to just rip the letter up. She didn't even want to see it. She didn't want to read the words. She just wanted it gone. Not long after she hung up the phone with her mother, her younger son Tim came in through the front door. He was all sweaty and covered in dirt from football practice, but he had a smile on his face. And right away, Linda asked him, "Hey, did you thank your coach for giving you a ride home?" And Tim nodded and said, "Yes, I did." You see, Linda didn't have a car. She couldn't afford one. So Tim's football coach always had to give him a ride home from practice. Linda always made sure Tim was polite about it. Tim assured her, "I thanked him, like always," and so Linda told him to hurry up and get his food because they had to go next door to the neighbor's party soon. Hours later, after 11 p.m. that evening, Linda and Tim were walking home from the party, making their way through the dark and quiet apartment complex. There had been about 7 other people at the party, and it had been a lot of fun. It was simple. Everybody just drank iced tea and played card games while they talked about the perks of living in this great new complex. They talked about the convenient business district right across the street and how responsive and helpful the maintenance team was. It was exactly the kind of friendly, neighborhood feeling Linda had been hoping for. So she was glad they went. She was also completely exhausted. And she knew her sister always came over for coffee first thing in the morning, so she needed to get to bed now or she would never be able to wake up on time. However, when she and Tim got back to their unit and she opened the front door, Linda froze right there in the doorway. Because there was already somebody inside their home, for a split second her heart jumped, thinking it might be an intruder. But then her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she realized it was just her older son, Jeff. He had come back. He was standing in the kitchen, leaning against the counter. He had a sort of, "I'm sorry" expression on his face. He looked guilty. Tim, her younger son, saw the situation, understood what was happening, and immediately and quietly disappeared into the second bedroom to give his mother and his brother some space to talk. Linda walked into the kitchen to join Jeff. He didn't say anything at first. So Linda decided to speak first. She gently reminded him that it was never a good idea to go to bed angry. However, Jeff still didn't say anything. He just looked down at the floor. And Linda knew from plenty of experience with her son that it was better not to force him to talk when he was like this. So she decided she would just give him a minute. She turned her back to him and began quietly washing the few dishes that were in the sink, giving him time to collect his thoughts. Finally, after a few moments of silence, Jeff mumbled that he loved his mom. And Linda smiled. She felt this huge sense of relief that they could just move on from their silly fight. She turned around and told him it was all good and that she loved him too. Then they both said goodnight. Jeff went over to the cot in the living room where he slept. And Linda finished up in the kitchen, turned off all the lights, and headed into her own bedroom. She closed her door behind her, and she went to bed. The next morning at 8:30 a.m., Linda's sister, Judy Butler, walked up the path to Linda's duplex. They had a routine. They had coffee together every single morning since they had both moved to the neighborhood. So Judy expected this morning to be like any other. She would knock on her sister's door and Linda would open it and she would go right in. But this time, after she knocked, nobody answered. There was just silence. So Judy waited a moment and then she knocked again, a little bit louder this time. And when there was still no response, Judy reached down and she tried the doorknob. But she found it was locked. This had never happened before. Linda always answered the door, or at least called out to say she was coming. But Judy wasn't really worried. Not yet. She just figured that Linda must have overslept or something. They had been at that party last night, after all. So Judy decided she would just go home for now and let her sister have a few more minutes of sleep. She figured eventually she would just call the house to check in on her and make sure she was okay. However, as she started to walk away from the home, she noticed something strange on the side of Linda's duplex. One of the back windows was missing its screen. The screen was just gone. And Judy knew that that particular window belonged to Linda's bedroom. And she was sure that it hadn't been like that yesterday. So, seeing it now, it made her feel a little bit uneasy. A small knot of concern started to form in her stomach. So she walked off the path and over to the side of the house to get a closer look. She went right up to the window and peered inside. And when she looked in, she saw her sister. Linda was in her bed, and she looked like she was fast asleep. And for a second, Judy was just relieved. This confirmed her theory. Her sister had just overslept. That's all this was. But then, as she kept looking, Judy realized there was something off about the way Linda was lying there. The way she was positioned, it just seemed wrong. It was unnatural. And then, in a horrifying flash, everything clicked into place for her. Her brain finally processed what her eyes were seeing. And in that moment, she staggered backwards away from the window and began to scream. By 9 a.m. on the 4th of September 1981, a crowd of reporters and police officers had surrounded the duplex in the Lakeland, Florida housing complex where a woman had reported seeing a dead body. In the middle of all the chaotic activity, Sergeant Edgar Pickett of the Lakeland Police ducked under a line of yellow crime scene tape. He headed towards the home's front walkway with a heavy bag of equipment slung over his shoulder. Now, Pickett was a veteran officer. He was actually just 1 year away from retirement after 2 long decades as a detective. And for the last few years of his career, he'd been the head of Lakeland's crime scene unit. This meant he was the one who oversaw the collection and the documentation of all the evidence at major crime scenes. So, while he wasn't the lead investigator on this particular case, when it came to the meticulous work of forensic analysis and fingerprint collection, he was the best they had. He'd already been briefed on the situation on his way over. He knew that this was very likely a homicide. The victim had been identified as 1-year-old Linda Slayton. He knew that Linda had been found in her bedroom by her sister, who had then flagged down a nearby maintenance worker and asked him to call 911. Pickett also knew that when the first responding officers got inside the house, they found that Linda's 2 kids were still asleep in their beds. They appeared to have absolutely no idea that their mother was deceased just in the next room. And Pickett knew right away that this fact would give the investigators a rough timeline to start with. It meant Linda was clearly alive when her kids went to sleep, and she must have died sometime during the night while they were still sleeping. As Pickett walked up the walkway towards the front door, he passed by 2 teenage boys who were sitting in their pajamas on the grass just outside the tape. He assumed, correctly, that these must be the sons. One of them just sort of stared straight ahead, his face a blank mask, seemingly in complete shock. The other, younger one, was sobbing quietly into his brother's shoulder. Pickett wasn't sure if any of the other officers had spoken to them yet, but he knew that they would likely be really helpful in focusing his search for evidence. Since they lived in the house, they would know the habits and the patterns of everyone who lived there. They might be able to tell him if anything at all seemed out of place. So, Pickett made a mental note to make sure to check in with the investigators who were already inside about that. Then, he stopped at the front door, looked at the house, and took a deep breath. Pickett liked to get a sort of first impression of a crime scene before he did any actual evidence collection. It was his process. So before he would go inside, he would do a slow walk around the entire exterior of the house and sort of assess the building. He had been told that all the doors were locked when the first police officers got there. And from what he could see now, the bedroom window with the missing screen was the only visible sign of a potential break-in. So he took out his kit and he spent some time carefully dusting around that window area for prints. But he didn't find much there. And he also didn't see any noticeable shoe impressions in the soft dirt outside beneath the window. And then, when he finally headed inside, Pickett quickly moved past all the other officers and detectives that were already milling about in the living room and kitchen. He went straight to Linda's bedroom. And the very first thing he saw when he got inside was Linda's body on the bed. There was a thin metal coat hanger wrapped tightly around her throat. The bed sheets all around her were covered in blood. She was shirtless, and the bottom of her dress was pulled up around her waist. And when Pickett got a little closer, he could see where all the blood had come from. There were long, very deep scratches all over Linda's neck, which he guessed were from her own fingernails. It looked like she had desperately tried to pry the hanger away from her throat. He would have to wait for the official autopsy report, of course, but it was clear just from looking at her wounds that the hanger had been used to strangle her to death. And considering she was partially naked and the positioning of her clothes, he guessed she had also likely been sexually assaulted. Pickett took a step back and slowly looked around the rest of the room, trying to decide where he should even begin his work. He needed to find as much forensic evidence in this room as was humanly possible. So, the first thing he did was try to mentally reconstruct what might have happened. He tried to guess how the killer might have moved through and interacted with the crime scene. That way he could follow their sort of imagined path with more intention and focus. He figured the killer must have come in through that open window, since that was the only entrance into the house that was obviously tampered with. He noted that Linda's purse and her jewelry were still sitting untouched on the dresser. The drawers of the dresser were all closed, as opposed to being pulled open and rifled through. So, it didn't seem like the killer had touched any of that stuff, which also meant this was likely not a robbery that had gone wrong. In fact, it seemed like the first and only thing the killer had done after entering the room was attack Linda. Because aside from the bloody bed, Pickett didn't see any other signs of a struggle. There were no knocked-over lamps, no chairs out of place. It seemed to him that Linda was likely caught completely off guard by a very fast and sudden attack, and she was unable to really fight back quickly. Because if she had, the room would probably be a huge mess. But then, Pickett's eyes caught a glimpse of Linda's closet, and he noticed that the clothes inside were all hanging on thin metal hangers that looked absolutely identical to the one that was wrapped around Linda's neck. And that's when a new theory hit him. The killer must have, at some point, been inside that closet, hiding. He supposed it was possible the killer could have broken in first and then grabbed a hanger from the closet once the attack started. But that would have taken too much time. It would have been clumsy and noisy, and it also would have given Linda a chance to get off the bed, or fight back, or yell out and maybe wake her sons up. It seemed much more likely, much more logical, that the killer had broken in earlier, before Linda even came home. He had hidden in the closet, and then he waited there in the dark until Linda was in her bed and asleep before he came out to attack. If Pickett was right about that, this murder became something very different. It was now a premeditated, thought-out murder, which meant the killer must have either known Linda personally or they had been watching her. They had been stalking her, because they would have had to have known her schedule, known when to sneak into the room and not be detected. At this point, Pickett took out his gear again and began thinking about how he was going to approach the evidence collection. He figured he would start at the window, since that was the point of entry. He would spend a lot of time there. And then he would move to the closet. Those would be his two primary areas of focus. And so, once he had that plan in his mind, he went back over to the window and he began meticulously looking for any trace evidence. And sure enough, after only a few minutes of carefully dusting the frame and the ledge, he smiled to himself. Because there, on the ledge, clear as day, was a very well-defined handprint. The following afternoon, over 24 hours after Linda's body had been found, Pickett sat in the precinct's fingerprint lab. He was hunched over a table, comparing two sets of prints with a large magnifying glass. He had been at it for hours already, and his head was pounding. After processing the crime scene the day before, Pickett had gone back to the station to review all the evidence he'd collected. And while he was there, he decided he would go check in with the lead detectives to get a full update on the case. And what they would tell him is that they had spoken to all of the neighbors, as well as Linda's family members, and they did have a few solid leads and a pretty clear timeline. According to Linda's kids, the older son Jeff had been dropped off at home at about 9:30 p.m. after being with his grandparents. Then Tim, the younger son, and Linda herself had gotten back from the neighbor's housewarming party just after 11 p.m. They had all gone to bed around midnight, and neither of the brothers had heard a single thing until the police woke them up the next morning. And all of this information had led the investigators to agree with Pickett's initial interpretation of the scene. Linda's attack had to have been very, very fast. It seemed like she had not been able to even scream, or else it almost certainly would have woken up her sons, especially Jeff, who was sleeping just on the other side of the wall. The autopsy report had also come in by then, and it confirmed that Linda had died from strangulation and that she had been sexually assaulted. The medical examiner had also been able to collect a semen sample from Linda's body, which meant they were definitely looking for a male perpetrator here. And since this was now clearly a sexually motivated crime, it meant that anybody Linda had been romantically involved with was now suddenly a top suspect. After speaking with Linda's family, the detectives had discovered that Linda had two serious ex-partners they needed to look at. There was her ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and her more recent ex-boyfriend, a man named Brendan Fowler. Frank, they learned, had apparently abused Linda when they were married, and he was still sending her very threatening letters even now. And Brendan was apparently very possessive and was known to have a bad temper. And Linda had broken up with him just 2 days before her murder. So some officers were already out looking for both of these men to bring them in for questioning. Pickett was eager to get both of their fingerprints. But for now, he was actually more focused on Linda's neighbors. When the detectives had done their initial canvass of the area, the neighbors they spoke to had confirmed that Linda and her younger son Tim were indeed at that party on the night she was killed. And since these neighbors were some of the last people to see Linda alive, they weren't just witnesses, they were also suspects. And so, Pickett had methodically collected fingerprints from all the men who had been at that party, specifically those who didn't have a solid alibi for the period of time after Linda went home. And that's what he was working on now, painstakingly comparing those prints to the clear print he had found on the windowsill. So far, none of them were a match. But they had also gotten blood samples from the neighbors, so Pickett would have to test those as well. In 1981, DNA testing as we know it didn't exist yet. But investigators could figure out somebody's blood type through various bodily fluids. So Pickett and his team could test those blood samples against the genetic material that was found on Linda's body, and at least rule out suspects that way. But Pickett had another, more urgent reason for wanting to be so diligent when it came to testing the people who lived in the complex. It was because after Linda's murder, just in the last 24 hours, there had been signs that the killer might actually still be in the area. At 3 a.m. that morning, one of Linda's neighbors, a woman who lived just a few doors down, had called the police to report that a stranger had broken into her house. And even though that person was long gone by the time the police arrived, they could see that her back door had clearly been forced open. And then another neighbor had called in to report that the screen on their window had been pried open as well. None of them were violent assaults like what had happened to Linda, but the timing was extremely suspicious. And it made Pickett wonder if there was a serial predator living right there in the complex. The department had ordered extra patrols in the area, and Pickett was supposed to get fingerprints for whoever they got calls about, so he was working with his police radio on right next to him, waiting for the next call. Pickett leaned back in his chair to give his tired eyes a rest. He knew he was getting pretty exhausted and would need to take a break soon. But just seconds later, a detective barged into the lab and told Pickett they needed him on standby for fingerprinting because they had just brought Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, in for questioning. Moments later, Pickett was standing just outside of an interrogation room, listening as a couple of detectives spoke with Brendan Fowler inside. Even though he couldn't see Brendan, Pickett could tell just by the sound of his voice that he was not happy to be there. He sounded argumentative and very defensive as he insisted over and over that he had absolutely nothing to do with Linda's death. And when he was asked about where he was on the night she died, he had an alibi. He said he was at home with his family, and he stayed there the entire night. He even gave the detectives his mom's phone number and told them they should call her to confirm his story. Pickett heard the detectives inside confer in hushed voices. Then they asked Brendan if he would be willing to take a polygraph test and also let them take his fingerprints. And to Pickett's surprise, Brendan said, "Yeah, go ahead." And as soon as Pickett heard that, he knew from experience that he had to move fast. He went right inside the room and got Brendan's fingerprints before Brendan could change his mind or lawyer up. On September 11th, exactly 1 week after Linda's murder, Pickett sat down at his desk and opened the local newspaper. And what he saw on the front page made him cringe. The Lakeland police chief had just given an interview, where he publicly admitted that they would not be making an arrest now or even in the next few days. And reading that in print was a stark reminder to Pickett of just how little progress they had actually made in this case. None of the neighbors' prints had been a match to the one Pickett had lifted off the windowsill. And they had tracked down Linda's ex-husband, Frank, but they found that he was all the way back in Alabama on the night Linda was killed with a solid alibi. As for Linda's ex-boyfriend, Brendan, he had seemed pretty guilty at first. During his polygraph test, the results had come back as inconclusive, which is always a red flag. And his alibi didn't completely check out either. His family had said that he was home at one point on the night Linda was killed, but they had all gone to sleep at some point and couldn't say for sure if maybe he had left the house later that night. But when Pickett had looked at Brendan's fingerprints, he had no choice but to clear him as a suspect. They clearly were not a match to the print from the scene. So now, Pickett knew the entire investigative team was scrambling for new leads, any leads at all. Which was why Pickett was not surprised by what he saw when he looked up from his newspaper. He saw a detective leading a suspect out of a precinct interrogation room after clearly questioning him. And it was Linda's own 5-year-old son, Jeff Slayton. And he was obviously crying. Pickett had heard through the grapevine that Jeff was being looked into as a suspect in his own mother's murder and that he had already been questioned a few times. The detectives had started getting interested in him when a few of Linda's family members had mentioned that Jeff and Linda had been fighting a lot in the weeks before she died. And when the investigators looked back at the crime scene photos, they realized that Jeff's cot in the living room shared a wall with Linda's bedroom. So it seemed very strange to them that he hadn't heard a single thing on the night she had died. But as far as Pickett knew, Jeff had a reasonable explanation for all of this. He had said that his fights with his mother were not that serious. He explained that they did fight on the night she died, but it was over a dumb argument about what time they should eat dinner. And he said he had no idea why he didn't wake up when she was attacked. He said he wished he had, so he could have gone in there and tried to help her. And on top of all that, Jeff had taken and passed a polygraph test. But for some reason, it seemed like the investigative team was not done with Jeff yet. And Pickett just sort of felt bad for the kid. He thought it was very unlikely at this point that Jeff was his own mother's killer. Pickett had kids of his own. And from his own experience, the fights Jeff was having with his mom just seemed like typical teenage behavior. Teenagers squabble with their parents. It's pretty normal. And it also just didn't line up with the physical evidence. Pickett was absolutely certain that the attacker had broken in through the window. That didn't make any sense for Jeff if he was sleeping right next door in the living room. And most importantly, Pickett had personally checked Jeff's prints against the one he had lifted from the window, and he knew for a fact that it was not a match. As the days turned into weeks, Pickett was starting to become convinced that the killer might be somebody without a personal connection to Linda. Maybe it was even a complete stranger. He knew that murders by strangers were much more rare than murders committed by a relative, a partner, or a friend, which was why he assumed the other detectives weren't really pursuing that angle. But through his own forensic work, Pickett had now eliminated pretty much everyone in Linda's life who had a clear motive or the opportunity to kill her. And Linda was a very attractive young woman who was also very outgoing. Pickett thought it was entirely possible that the killer could be a stranger who had only interacted with her once, maybe saw her at the store, and then sort of became fixated on her. It seemed plausible. And so after Pickett watched Jeff leave with the detective, he tried to go back to reading his newspaper, but he couldn't focus. He kept thinking about Linda. He had been so sure that this case would be solved quickly by the forensics, by the evidence, but now he wasn't sure if it would be solved at all. And that worry only got stronger and stronger as the months went by, and fewer leads came in. And before long, a whole year had passed. And it was actually time for Pickett to retire. And when he walked out of the precinct for the very last time, he had a pit in his stomach because he had a terrible feeling that without him pushing for it, Linda's case was going to get put on a shelf and eventually forgotten. One afternoon in the fall of 2001, 2 full decades after Linda Slayton was murdered, a detective named Brad Grace sat in his office at the Lakeland Police Department. He was reading over Linda's thick, dusty cold case file. For the last 4 years, Grace had been tasked with sorting through the department's many cold cases and choosing which ones to officially reopen. And this had been a really slow and painstaking process because he had to do all of that while also juggling his active caseload. So even though he'd technically been assigned Linda's case for years, he was just now starting to really dig into it. But the delay didn't worry him too much. Because the whole reason this particular case had appealed to him in the first place was because he was sure he could solve it and solve it quickly. And that was because it had one crucial thing: DNA evidence. Back in 1981, when the murder actually happened, the genetic material that was found on Linda's body was only good for eliminating suspects through their blood type. But now, in 2001, Grace could use that very same material to create a full DNA profile of Linda's killer. And he intended on reaching out to everybody who was involved in the original investigation to get their DNA to test against this new profile. But before he did that, he wanted to completely familiarize himself with all the suspects from 1981. So there was Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, who had abused Linda repeatedly during their marriage. And even though they had been divorced for years, he was apparently still sending her all these threatening letters right around the time of her murder. And then there was her more recent romantic partner, Brendan Fowler, who was known to have a bad temper and seemed to be very controlling of Linda. And they had broken up only 2 days before her murder, so he could have still been furious about it. The neighbors who were at the party Linda had gone to were also suspects. Everybody in that group knew when Linda was heading home, so it was possible somebody could have followed her and then snuck into her bedroom before she went to bed. And then finally, there was Jeff Slayton, Linda's oldest son, who was actually in the house during the murder. His brother Tim had been there too, of course, but Jeff had actually admitted to getting into a big fight with Linda earlier that same day. Now, all of these suspects had been cleared back in the day through fingerprints, alibis, or polygraphs, but Grace knew that DNA testing was way more accurate than any of those old methods of elimination. And so basically, even if they'd been ruled out for one of those 3 things, a DNA match would override all of that. And so he wasn't going to let these previous eliminations cloud his judgment. He had already decided that no matter what, he was just going to focus on whatever the forensics told him and not be biased by the old investigation. But for now, he just wanted to kick things off by speaking with the 2 people who had known Linda better than anybody else in the world, her sons, Tim and Jeff. A few days later, Grace walked into a small meeting room at the precinct where he'd been told Jeff and Tim Slayton were waiting for him. And as soon as he saw the 2 brothers, he just started laughing. Because he realized he already knew Jeff Slayton. They had bowled together in a local league for years. But it had never occurred to Grace that this Jeff Slayton, the victim's son, was the same Jeff from his bowling team. And Jeff recognized Grace at the exact same time. So they spent a little while talking and laughing about what a crazy, small-world coincidence this was. And so when Grace finally sat down with Jeff and with Tim, the atmosphere was already a bit more relaxed. Grace's first line of questioning wasn't about the case at all. It was just personal. He just asked them, "Hey, how are you guys holding up after all these years? How have you dealt with this horrible thing?" And for the next few minutes, the mood in the room got pretty heavy as the 2 brothers spoke honestly about how terrible the last 20 years had been for them. After their mother had been killed, they both said that they were terrified that they were going to get hurt too. Because the killer was never caught, they always felt like they were looking over their shoulder, wondering who was going to be next. Jeff said he started sleeping with a knife under his pillow. He eventually got so depressed that he dropped out of high school. And Tim admitted that he also struggled a lot, but he took a different path. He relied on his football team and his friends for support. He kept pictures of all of them around his room to remind himself to try and stay positive. After that, the brothers shared what they could remember about the night their mother had died. But it was obvious to Grace that Tim and Jeff didn't really have any new information that he didn't already have inside the case file. So, instead of continuing to question them about the details of the case, Grace explained to them that this murder was going to be solved through DNA. And because of that, he needed to collect DNA samples from every single person who was involved in this case back in the day. And that, he explained, included both of them. The brothers looked surprised for a moment, but then they both nodded and said, "Of course, whatever you need." So Grace stood up and said he would send a lab technician inside to get their samples. But before he left the room, he looked both of them in the eye, and he promised them that he would find their mom's killer. He told them he was not going to retire until he did. Later that month, Grace sat in front of a computer screen in the station's computer lab, reading a police report from 1982. Since speaking to the two Slayton brothers, Grace had collected DNA from dozens of people who were involved in the case. From 1981, he got samples from Jeff, Tim, and also Linda's ex-husband, Frank Slayton, and her ex-boyfriend, Brendan Fowler. He'd also tested the old blood samples that the original investigators had gotten from Linda's neighbors. But none of them, not a single one, matched the DNA profile for Linda's killer. This was hugely disappointing because it meant that Grace had to basically start from scratch. But when he had gone back to the original case notes, he noticed the mention of those other break-ins that had happened around the complex shortly after Linda's murder. And it made him wonder if Linda was killed by a serial predator who was just active in the area at the time. And if that was true, then this person probably would not have just hurt Linda. They would have other victims too. So Grace had run the killer's DNA through the FBI's national database. And when it didn't match anything in there, he had reached out to the local county sheriff's department to see if they could send him any cases from that era that felt similar to Linda's. And they had sent over the very report that he was reading right now. And it felt incredibly promising. In 1982, just a year after Linda's murder, a man named Jimmy Murr was arrested for climbing through a 10-year-old girl's bedroom window, and then assaulting and strangling her. And according to his file, Jimmy had a long history of home invasions and very violent behavior. And as soon as Grace finished reading the report, he jumped up from his chair and went to go find one of his officers. He wanted to dig up as much information on this Jimmy Murr as he possibly could and see if maybe they could go track him down. About a month later, Grace sat at his desk, staring at his phone in anxious anticipation. He was waiting for an incredibly important phone call, one that would confirm whether or not Jimmy Murr was Linda's killer. After doing a deep background check on Jimmy, Grace had found out that Jimmy actually knew someone who lived at Linda's complex. And he was literally staying with them at their duplex at the same time Linda was killed. Now, Jimmy himself was not alive anymore. But they had managed to get in touch with his mother, who had agreed to give them her DNA. And they were testing it now. This DNA would not be an exact match to the killer's DNA, of course, but it would show if she was at least a close relative of the killer. And as Grace waited for the lab to call, his heart was pounding in his chest. Because for the first time since he'd picked up Linda's case, everything finally seemed to make sense. Jimmy was a violent serial home invader. He had probably seen Linda while he was staying at his friend's house, and maybe he stalked her for a few days until he saw an opportunity to attack. And then, after he killed her, he must have compulsively kept breaking into other homes in the complex to try and find more victims. It all fit. Just then, his phone rang. Grace snatched it up. He could feel his mouth going dry as he heard it was the lab on the other end of the line. He was going to get his answer right here, right now. But just a second later, they told him the news. It was not a match. Grace's stomach dropped. But he managed to thank them anyway, and he hung up the phone. He couldn't believe it. Despite all the suspects and all the modern forensic evidence that they had, this case was once again at a dead end. Still, Grace kept pushing forward. As the months turned into years, he would regularly find new potential suspects, and he would eventually clear them one by one. He also kept sending the killer's DNA profile to the FBI to run it through their database, just in case any new additions were added in that could be a match. But eventually, over a decade passed by, and Grace still had not been able to match anybody to the killer's DNA. And in 2015, his own health began to decline. and he finally had to make the phone call he hoped he would never have to make. He picked up the phone, and he dialed Jeff Slayton's number. And when Jeff picked up, Grace told him that he had to retire. And that he was sorry, but he still had not found his mother's killer. In June of 2019, 4 years into his retirement, Brad Grace sat on the deck of his Florida home reading a newspaper. He was deep into an article when his cell phone started to ring. And when he looked at the caller ID, he was surprised to see that it was from the Lakeland Police Department. He hadn't gotten a call from them in years. So he immediately picked it up to see what they wanted. And when he did, the person on the other end introduced himself as the detective who had taken over the Linda Slayton case. The detective said they knew Grace was retired now, but they figured he would want to hear this. They said they had hired a genetic genealogist to track down family members of the killer based on that DNA profile that Grace had ordered all those years ago. And through that long and complicated process, they had finally been able to get a match. And after they got the match, they also managed to get the suspect's fingerprints. And those prints, they said, were a perfect match to the palm print that the head of the crime scene unit, Sergeant Edgar Pickett, had taken at the original crime scene 38 years earlier. Grace sat up straight in his chair and listened intently as the detective finally told him who Linda's killer actually was. And when he heard the name, he couldn't believe it. The suspect had been so close the whole time. Based on DNA, forensic evidence, and 38 years of police investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Linda Slayton in the early morning hours of September 4th, 1981. The house was all quiet as the killer waited patiently inside of Linda's closet. Hours earlier, when Linda was out at the party with her son, the killer had removed the screen from her bedroom window and had crept silently inside. And then they had hidden themselves in this closet, waiting for her to come home. The killer had been watching Linda for a while now. They had been finding ways to get close to her and her family. But Linda never really acknowledged them or paid any special attention to them at all. Tonight, though, the killer was determined to show Linda that she was not the one in control. They were. And now, the killer stood in the dark, cramped closet, holding their breath as their heart pounded in their chest. They listened as Linda opened her bedroom door and walked inside. The killer continued to wait anxiously as they heard the quiet sounds of Linda getting ready for bed, getting changed. And then, eventually, they heard the sound of the springs of the bed compressing as Linda laid down to shut her eyes for the night. And then, after the killer was sure Linda was in her bed and the lights were off and it was quiet in the room, they waited even longer, just to make sure that Linda was deeply asleep and that her children were asleep as well. And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they reached up and they grabbed a metal coat hanger off the hook in the closet. And then they burst out of the closet door. And before Linda could do anything, before she could make a sound or even react, she was totally caught off guard. The killer was on top of her, and they had wrapped the coat hanger tight around her throat. Linda struggled. She clawed at her own throat to try and get this thing off of her. But the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda. And then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was finished, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through, and they wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out that Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, a man named Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life. He would drive him to and from practice every single day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a helpful mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently developed a dark and total fixation on Tim's mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning. He was watching. He was figuring out how and when he would attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph Mills was actually interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder. But he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice every day. And Tim would, even very tragically, begin to rely on Joseph for emotional support as he was grieving the loss of his mother. He was confiding in her killer, and he just didn't know. And then, even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung up in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was a picture of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row of that very picture. In December of 2019, Joseph Mills was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. On the freezing night of the 3rd of January 1804, 22-year-old Thomas Millwood sat inside a crowded pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling thoroughly annoyed. Normally, Thomas was an upbeat, social young man. He worked hard as a local bricklayer, and every day after his grueling shift, he would meet his friends at this tavern to drink ale, share stories, and laugh. But tonight, everything irritated him. As his friends droned on about the latest drama gripping their town, Thomas snapped. He slammed his pewter beer mug onto the table with a loud crash. The pub went dead silent. Realizing he had overreacted, Thomas muttered an embarrassed apology, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the exit. Just as he opened the door, his friends called out with genuine concern, "Hey, be careful you call it there, Thomas." Thomas rolled his eyes, muttered a dismissive, "Yeah, okay," and stepped into the bitter winter night. Thomas decided to walk to his parents' house nearby to warm up by the fire before meeting his wife. She worked late hours at a local estate, and Thomas always escorted her home safely. As he turned on to Black Lion Lane, the streets were entirely deserted. This was unusual for Hammersmith, a bustling town of 45,000 residents just outside London. Lately, however, a suffocating fear had settled over the community. For 2 months, a string of bizarre sightings and violent late-night attacks had left residents terrified to step outside after dark. Thomas thought the panic was absolute nonsense. He had done his best to ignore the gossip, but escaping it was becoming impossible. As he rounded a dark corner, he nearly collided with 2 men walking in the opposite direction. Startled, Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but one of the men shrieked, "Get back!" One man brandished a heavy wooden club, while the other gripped a pistol in his waistband. Thomas immediately threw his hands up to show he was not a threat. Relaxing their stance, the man with the club warned, "It's dangerous to be out here alone. You shouldn't be out by yourself." Before Thomas could reply, they hurried past him into the shadows. Thomas shook his head, thoroughly annoyed by the encounter. Reaching his parents' house, he found the front door securely bolted. He knocked loudly, and a moment later his sister Anne approached from the other side. "Who's there?" she called out anxiously. "It's me, Anne," Thomas replied. "Step back from the door so I can see you through the peephole," she insisted. Thomas groaned, but complied. Once Anne verified his identity, she unlocked the door, pulled him inside, and immediately locked it behind him. Her very first question was, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas instantly regretted coming. It didn't matter where you went in Hammersmith, everyone was obsessed with the attacks. The townspeople were absolutely convinced that a malevolent ghost was haunting them. The hysteria had begun 2 months earlier when a white figure was spotted in the church cemetery. It was soon discovered that the figure was just the butcher's son dressing up in women's clothing as a prank. But the panic didn't stop. A week later, a chimney sweep claimed he saw a phantom vanish into the graveyard dirt. Then, the physical attacks began. A pregnant woman was choked by a pale figure before escaping. A carriage driver was confronted by a creature with horns, causing him to abandon his horses and passengers. By late December, terror gripped the entire town. Thomas tried to convince his family that a ghost couldn't physically choke people, it had to be a human prankster using the rumors as a cover. But logic failed when a heavily pregnant woman died following an assault. She claimed a figure in a white robe and a pointed hat rose from the ground and grabbed her. She fainted from terror and died shortly after being found by neighbors. Following her death, the town offered a massive financial reward to anyone who could capture or kill the Hammersmith ghost. Citizens formed armed vigilante groups, completely consumed by panic. Inside his parents' home, Thomas sat by the fire, drifting off to sleep. Looking at the frost on the window, he dreaded going back into the freezing cold. He suggested to Anne that he might just sleep on the floor and let his wife walk home alone. Anne exploded. "Are you out of your mind?" she shouted. "She will be the next victim of the ghost. Get out there and protect your wife." Thomas groaned, grabbed his jacket, and stepped back into the night. His frustration boiled over. He decided that if he ran into this ghost, he would sprint straight at him and beat him up to prove to the entire town that it was just a man. Marching briskly down Black Lion Lane, Thomas noticed a massive bush on the sidewalk. He stopped and squinted. Behind the branches, a dark figure was crouched low, trying to hide. Thomas's heart raced with adrenaline. This is the prankster, he thought. Without hesitation, Thomas balled his hands into fists and launched into a full sprint toward the bush. At that exact moment, Anne was looking out her window and heard a loud, agonizing male scream. Terrified that her brother was being attacked, she bolted outside. Minutes later, a large posse of men burst out of the pub Thomas had left earlier. They were led by Francis Smith, the town's mild-mannered tax collector. Francis looked completely unhinged, out of breath, and terrified. He led the armed men down Black Lion Lane, where they suddenly froze. Lying in the dirt road was a motionless body. Crouched over the corpse was a dark, shadowy figure. As the posse approached, the figure whipped its head around and let out a blood-curdling shriek of grief. The night watchman rushed forward, tackling the dark figure to the ground. The rest of the men ran to the body, assuming they had found the ghost's latest victim. They were tragically wrong. The person hiding behind the bush had been Francis Smith. He wasn't the ghost, he was a terrified citizen waiting to ambush the spirit for the reward. The tragedy came down to Thomas's clothing. As a bricklayer, Thomas wore his work uniform, stark white linen trousers, a white jacket, and a white apron. To Francis, crouching in the dark and primed to see a phantom, a figure in all white charging at him out of the shadows, was a nightmare. Panicking, Francis raised his shotgun and fired. The blast hit Thomas squarely in the face, killing him instantly. The monstrous dark figure cradling Thomas's body was just his sister Anne, wearing a dark shawl, weeping over her dead brother. The tragedy shocked England. On the 11th of January 1804, Francis Smith was tried for murder. The jury, knowing he acted out of genuine terror, tried to find him guilty of manslaughter. However, the judge ruled that mistake of fact was no defense for murder. Smith was sentenced to hang. Recognizing the lack of malice, King George III intervened 5 weeks later, commuting Smith's sentence to just 1 year of hard labor. Soon after, the town's shoemaker confessed to being the true Hammersmith ghost. He had used the disguise to terrify his apprentices as revenge for telling scary ghost stories to his children. The case was debated for over 150 years. Ultimately, the tragic death of Thomas Millwood led to modern self-defense laws, establishing that a person is legally permitted to use force if they honestly and reasonably believe they are in imminent danger, even if they are completely mistaken. On the freezing night of the 3rd of January 1804, a 22-year-old man named Thomas Millwood sat inside a crowded neighborhood pub in Hammersmith, England, feeling completely and utterly annoyed. Under normal circumstances, Thomas was a remarkably upbeat, cheerful, and highly social person. He worked hard as a local bricklayer, and basically every single day after his grueling physical shift ended, he would head straight to this local tavern to meet up with his closest friends. Together, they would have some drinks, share rowdy stories, and laugh away the exhaustion of the day.
It was their daily ritual, and it was always a great time. But tonight, it was like everything under the sun annoyed Thomas. He found himself especially irritated by his friends. As they droned on and on, obsessing over the current drama going on in their small town, Thomas felt a hot surge of impatience rising in his chest. He finally just had enough. Before he could stop himself, he stood up abruptly and slammed his heavy pewter beer mug down onto the wooden table with a resounding crash. Right away, Thomas knew he had severely overdone it. The moment the mug struck the wood, the entire pub went deadly silent. The chatter died, his friends all stopped talking mid-sentence, and absolutely everybody in the room turned to look directly at him. Feeling a wave of embarrassment, Thomas kind of muttered a hasty apology and then quickly grabbed his heavy winter coat. He stood up and just began walking toward the exit, desperately wanting to leave the pub. The tavern remained totally silent as he walked across the floor. Then, right as he was about to step out the door and into the street, his friends finally broke the tense silence. They called out to him, their voices laced with genuine anxiety, and said, "Hey, be careful out there." Thomas didn't turn around to look back. He just rolled his eyes, muttered a dismissive, "Yeah, okay," and then he went outside into the bitter, biting cold. Thomas decided he would walk over to his parents' house, which was located not very far away. His plan was simple. He would just sit by their fireplace and warm up for a little bit before he had to go back out later that night to meet up with his wife. His wife worked incredibly long hours at a local estate, and she often worked quite late into the night. Whenever she worked late, Thomas made it a strict rule to walk to her workplace, meet her when her shift ended, and personally escort her back home to ensure she was safe. That was exactly what he was planning on doing tonight, but he had some time to kill beforehand. As Thomas began walking briskly down Black Lion Lane, he noticed that, per usual, he was basically one of the only people outside. Hammersmith used to be a very friendly, lively, and bustling place. It was home to roughly 45,000 residents and was located right on the prosperous outskirts of London. In fact, it was so beautiful that lots of rich people liked to go there just to vacation. But recently, the entire atmosphere of the town had completely changed. There had been a string of increasingly bizarre late-night sightings and violent encounters or attacks, as the frantic townspeople were calling them. This ongoing phenomenon had all the residents completely on edge, to the agonizing point where people were flat out refusing to go outside after the sun went down. Now, Thomas thought the entire situation was totally ridiculous. In his mind, people were completely overreacting to shadows and rumors. Because of this, he had been doing his absolute best to ignore the endless drama going on in town, but it was getting harder and harder to do that. As Thomas rounded a dark corner on the lane, the reality of the town's panic smacked him right in the face. He nearly walked directly into two men who were walking the opposite direction. When Thomas looked up to apologize for almost colliding with them, one of the men shrieked in absolute terror, "Get back!" Thomas blinked in shock. In the dim light, he saw that the man who shouted was holding a heavy wooden club tightly in his hand, raising it defensively. The other guy had a loaded pistol tucked into his waist, and his hand was clamped firmly onto the pistol grip, ready to draw and fire. Thomas instinctively threw both of his hands up into the air to show he was completely unarmed and was not a threat. At that point, seeing that he was just a regular young man, the first man slowly lowered his club, and the other guy took his hand off his pistol grip. One of them looked at Thomas, his voice trembling, and said, "Hey, it's dangerous to be out here alone." "You should not be out here by yourself." Before Thomas could even say anything back to them, the two men quickly walked past him, quickened their pace, and completely disappeared around the dark corner. By now, Thomas was only a few houses away from his parents' home. He just kind of brushed off the unsettling incident, speed-walked the rest of the way, and mentally cursed the two men under his breath for their ridiculous, paranoid warning about how dangerous it was out here. A minute later, Thomas arrived at his parents' house. He walked up to the front door, expecting it to be open, because normally his parents kept the door unlocked for family. But when he tried the knob tonight, it was firmly locked. He knocked loudly. A second later, he heard the cautious footsteps of his sister Anne coming toward the door inside the house. She called out warily through the thick wood, "Who's there?" Thomas groaned. "It's me, Anne." But apparently, just hearing his voice was not enough to satisfy her. Anne called back through the door, "Well, I don't know if it's really you, so back up so I can see your whole person through the peephole." Thomas rolled his eyes in exasperation, but he did exactly what his sister asked. He stepped back several feet into the cold street and allowed her to inspect his entire body through the small viewing hole. At that point, he finally heard Anne fumbling frantically with the heavy iron lock. The door was unlocked, and she opened it up. Thomas stepped inside, and his sister immediately shut and locked the door securely behind him. Her very first question to Thomas wasn't a greeting. She just looked at him and asked, "Well, did you see it?" Thomas immediately wished he had not come to his parents' house at all. He had walked all this way specifically to avoid talking about this stupid, exhausting topic, but he quickly realized that if he had gone back to his own house, he likely would have gotten the exact same question from his mother-in-law, who lived with him and his wife. The truth was, it didn't really seem to matter where you went in Hammersmith or who you talked to. The conversation was always going to be exactly the same. It was always going to be about these late-night attacks because the people of Hammersmith were absolutely, unshakably convinced that these crimes were being committed by a literal ghost. The entire mass hysteria had started about 2 months earlier, in November, when somebody spotted a mysterious, pale figure lurking ominously in the church cemetery. Thomas firmly believed the panic should have stopped right then and there, because only a couple of days after that initial sighting, the truth was figured out. It was discovered that the figure was actually just the local butcher's son. He had just been dressing up in women's clothes and walking around in the cemetery purely as a prank to scare his friends. It was a joke. A prank. That was it. But the terror in town did not go away. A week after this first weird sighting, there was another, more sinister sighting in the exact same cemetery. A local chimney sweep claimed he saw someone walking around in the graveyard who literally disappeared straight into the ground. Admittedly, a lot of the more level-headed people in Hammersmith brushed that second sighting off as just pure imagination and hysteria. But it was right after this second sighting that the so-called attacks began in town. Late one night, a resident was walking past the cemetery perimeter when something rushed up silently behind them and began violently choking them. This resident was somehow able to break free from the grip and run away to safety, but as they fled, they turned and got a clear look at whatever was attacking them. They described the assailant as a terrifying phantom. Shortly after that, a local carriage driver was navigating his vehicle past the cemetery when he had to get out for some reason. Suddenly, a horrific creature with literal horns on its head came charging out of the darkness and confronted the driver. The driver was so overwhelmed by fear that he turned and ran away on foot, completely abandoning his 8 horses and his 16 passengers to fend for themselves. By late December, there had been so many more of these strange attacks and weird sightings that basically every single person in Hammersmith, save for Thomas, was totally gripped by a paralyzing fear. As terror spread like wildfire across the town, Thomas had repeatedly attempted to convince his wife, his mother-in-law, and his family that there was just no physical way this was a real ghost. He argued constantly that it was nothing more than people's paranoia and their imaginations running wild. But Thomas's logical theory was put into serious question when just a few days earlier, somebody actually died following one of these attacks. And it wasn't just anyone. A pregnant woman had died. The woman had been walking alone near the church cemetery at about 10 o'clock at night when something in the graveyard rose up out of the ground, rushed over to her, and grabbed onto her tightly. She barely had time to turn and look, catching only a glimpse of a white flowing robe and a long, pointed white hat before she fainted from sheer terror. When she woke up again, she was inside a neighbor's house, surrounded by worried citizens who had found her passed out in the dirt and carried her inside. She came to, but she was only able to choke out the terrifying story of what had happened to her, the story of the ghost attack, before her body gave out and she died. Following the tragic death of this pregnant woman, the town of Hammersmith officially offered a massive financial reward for anybody who could capture or kill the entity, which was now being dubbed the Hammersmith Ghost. The night watchmen began doing extra patrols every single hour. In fact, those two men Thomas had bumped into earlier, the guy with the club and the guy with the gun, were on their own citizen patrol. The ghost, and how to capture or kill it, was basically the only thing people in Hammersmith wanted to talk about. It was what was being discussed at the pub by his friends when Thomas got so mad that he slammed his cup down and left. To Thomas, the very idea of capturing or killing a ghost made absolutely no sense, because ghosts simply aren't real. By this point, the butcher's son had even come forward publicly and said, "Look, I didn't do any of these other attacks. That's not me. I only did the very first one." He even had a rock-solid alibi to prove it. But to Thomas, this didn't rule out that the ghost was a physical person. To Thomas, it just meant there was somebody else in town who was actively copying the butcher's son's prank, except they had obviously taken the jokes way too far because they had gotten someone killed. At about 10 o'clock, Thomas was sitting comfortably inside his parents' house by the fire, just beginning to doze off. As he sat there in the warmth, he thought to himself how little he wanted to go back out into the freezing cold night just to walk with his wife all the way back home. He honestly would have much rather just stayed right here, slept on the floor for the night, and let his wife walk home on her own. But when he floated this lazy idea to his sister Anne, who was standing nearby, she completely exploded on him. "Are you kidding me?" she shouted. "You're gonna let your wife walk home alone in this terrifying environment? She's going to be the next victim of the Hammersmith Ghost. Get out there right now and protect your wife." Thomas held up his hands defensively. Okay, he muttered. He reluctantly got up, grabbed his jacket, and walked back outside into the freezing air. The moment Thomas stepped outside, he felt a massive wave of frustration. He was feeling so intensely annoyed at the current situation that a reckless, angry thought formed in his head. You know what? If I run into that stupid Hammersmith ghost tonight, the person disguised as a ghost, I am going to bum rush them and beat them up. It will prove to this entire cowardly town, once and for all, that there was never any ghost, and that it was just a regular person the whole time. Fueled by anger, Thomas began walking briskly down the road. He turned onto Black Lion Lane, and almost immediately his eyes caught something. Off to the side of the road, right on the sidewalk, was a massive bush. Thomas could have sworn that behind this bush there was something or someone crouched down low, like they were deliberately trying to hide in the shadows. Thomas stopped dead in his tracks. He squinted hard through the darkness in the direction of the bush. As he watched, he saw a distinct movement, just enough to confirm to him that there was absolutely a human being hiding back there. Suddenly, everything clicked perfectly for Thomas. That must be the person pretending to be the ghost, he thought. That's the prankster. That's the murderer. There they are. Without a single second of hesitation, Thomas balled up his fists, locked his eyes on the bush, and launched into a full-blown sprint directly toward the hidden person. At virtually the exact same time, back inside the house, Anne was standing near the window, looking out roughly in the direction that her brother had gone. Suddenly, cutting through the quiet night air, she heard a loud, agonizing scream that sounded distinctly like a man. She couldn't see her brother from where she stood, but a horrific thought hit her. Oh my God, that's coming from the exact area where he went. What if he's getting attacked by the ghost? Terrified for his life, she bolted out the front door and ran into the darkness. Just a couple of minutes after that, a massive, rowdy posse of men came tumbling out of the very pub where Thomas had been drinking earlier that night. They came stumbling out into the cold, but they were not being led by the night watchman, even though a watchman was present in the crowd. Instead, they were being led by the town's mild-mannered tax collector, a man named Francis Smith. Francis looked completely disheveled, entirely out of breath, and frantic. He did not look at all like the type of guy who would be leading a big angry posse, but here he was. He led the men down the road at a full run, and they turned the corner onto Black Lion Lane. The moment the posse looked down the lane, they stopped dead in their tracks. Lying right in the middle of the dirt road was a human body, and it didn't appear to be moving at all. Crouched directly over the body was a dark, shadowy figure, hunched low over the torso. The figure suddenly turned, looked straight at the approaching posse, and let out an unbelievable, blood-curdling shriek. The men in the posse backed up in pure terror, completely unsure of what to do. But the night watchman suddenly broke ranks. He began sprinting directly at the creature that was perched over the body. He threw his weight forward, tackled the figure hard onto the ground, and pinned them tightly to the earth. At the same time, seeing that the threat was pinned, the rest of the posse rushed over to the body in the road to see if the victim was still alive and if there was any way they could help. But unfortunately, the moment they looked down at the body, they could tell the person was already dead. The posse genuinely believed they had just discovered the latest tragic victim of the Hammersmith ghost, and that they had successfully captured the ghost itself, the black creature the watchman had tackled onto the ground. But they were completely wrong. When Thomas had rounded the corner onto Black Lion Lane and looked into that bush, the figure moving around really was a living human being. It was Francis Smith, the tax collector. However, Francis was not hiding behind that bush because he was pretending to be the Hammersmith ghost, which was what Thomas had assumed when he charged him. Instead, Francis was hiding behind that bush because he was actively laying in wait for the ghost. He was hoping the spirit would walk past his hiding spot so he could run out, capture or kill it, and claim the town's reward. Basically, Francis was trying to do the exact same thing Thomas was doing. The only difference was that Francis actually believed in the ghost, and Thomas did not. It was just Thomas's horrific bad luck that, on that specific night, he had chosen to wear his everyday work clothes. Because he was a bricklayer, his uniform consisted of a stark, all-white jacket, white trousers, and a white apron. To Francis, who was crouching behind the bush, terrified and desperately waiting for a phantom dressed in white robes, seeing a figure in all white suddenly sprint out of the darkness directly at him was his worst nightmare. When the two men spotted each other, they both attacked. Except Francis was armed with a shotgun. As Thomas ran up to the bush to punch him in the face, Francis panicked, raised his gun, and pulled the trigger. The blast hit Thomas directly in the face and throat, killing him instantly. But even after shooting him, Francis had absolutely no idea he had just killed a real person. He was so incredibly jacked up on adrenaline and terror that he thought he had shot the actual ghost, but he was too afraid to check the body alone. He ran straight to the pub, gathered the posse, and said, "Hey, I got the ghost!" "Come on!" When they all ran back to Black Lion Lane, Thomas's sister Anne had already made it to the scene. She was the creature crouched over the body, screaming out of pure, unadulterated grief. She had just found her dead brother and was reacting to the horror when the watchman mistakenly tackled her to the ground. Luckily, the posse quickly realized their mistake, and Anne was not harmed. On the 11th of January, 1804, Francis Smith was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. However, recognizing the total lack of malice and the genuine element of terror involved, the King of England intervened 5 weeks later, pardoning Francis and shortening his sentence to just 1 year of hard labor. The true identity of the subsequent Hammersmith ghost attacks was later revealed to be the town's shoemaker, who confessed to the crimes out of guilt following Thomas's murder. He admitted he only did it to terrify his apprentices as revenge because they had scared his own children with ghost stories. The legal fallout of the Hammersmith ghost incident was fiercely debated in courts for more than 150 years. Ultimately, this bizarre tragedy led to a foundational, modern-day legal ruling which states that a person is legally allowed to use force in self-defense if they truly and reasonably believe they are in imminent danger, even if they are completely mistaken about the danger they actually face. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya.